Hello and welcome to Cinema to the Letter. This episode, it's that masterpiece known as Who Framed Roger Rabbit. On Cinema to the Letter, we break down the very nature of cinema, letter by letter. For each episode of a film miniseries topic, we cover 6 films that fit a C for a classic, I for an indie, N for new, E for egregious, M for masterpiece, and A for atypical. Who doesn't love an acronym, am I right? I am Thomas, and I am a sensitive and sober fellow.
Hi, I'm Bryan, and I always knew I'd get it in Toontown.
But welcome everybody, yes, to Cinema to the Letter, where we are at in our acronym, where we, cover individual movies and stuff. For this one, we've reached M for masterpiece, which we, as we mentioned, like in our setup, in our initial episode, we're kind of going for more modern era, so basically like anything from 1980 to about 2019, and anything after that is new, anything before that is a classic. But I don't want to even ask about like masterpiece blockbusters from you. I want to ask a very crucial thing that I think is so important for setup for this particular episode. What's your relationship with the Looney Tunes? Because, like, full disclosure, we have a bit of an age difference.
Yes, a little bit.
There's an age gap, so we're canceled. But with we have a bit of an age gap, and I think it's not extremely important, except for something like what cartoons we watched. I think are quite different.
Yeah, I didn't like watch them a lot growing up. I remember watching like some of the like, I don't know the structure of how they were, but like I remember catching like a few of them on Cartoon Network at times.
Right.
I didn't love them. I wasn't like hooked. I think as a kid I was very like, I think averse to like any animation that wasn't, like I didn't like another like animation thing is like Shaun the Sheep. I didn't like it because they didn't talk and stuff like that. So I loved kind of some of the comedic bits. I remember like for some reason loving Marvin the Martian. That's his name, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I remember loving him for some reason. Like I caught an episode with him and I was like, that guy's cool. But it wasn't like an integral part of me growing up. It was kind of one of those things I feel like where I just kind of knew what Looney Tunes was just because of growing up in America. But I have kind of grown to really love, obviously this movie's a part of it, but I've come to love the Looney Tunes and just the animation style and everything. But yeah, that's sort of my kind of weird history with the Looney Tunes. What about you? Did you like grow up watching any of them?
I mean, I was going to say that I think that's the big thing where you mentioned Cartoon Network. Like, I grew up back in my day. Cartoon Network was a newer, like it started in like 92, and there was a certain point where like they were making original cartoons pretty much from the start, but they had 24 hours to fill on a cable network, so they just showed anything and everything they possibly could, including a lot of Looney Tunes stuff. And I definitely I just considered Looney Tunes on level with like Dexter's Laboratory or like Powerpuff Girls, because they were like so like on the same channel and stuff. And to be fair, that's also how I know like through Boomerang in particular about like those characters, or also the Hanna-Barbera characters, any of those things. And I feel like that's a thing that's very much gone away in recent years. I think particularly like post like you being a kid, there's a lot less of like people having any knowledge of what even the Looney Tunes are beyond like whatever like product they're selling, or in the case of like putting in advertising in cinematic form, either Space Jam, which is just a series of fucking ads. To the degree that like my little like nephew, he only knows about the Looney Tunes through Space Jam: A New Legacy. because he's like 5.
What a sad life he's living so far.
I mean, look, he loves all the Looney Tunes. He loves Bugs and Daffy and LeBron, our favorite Looney Tune. I really love, personally, I prefer the Bob Clampett LeBron cartoons. Friz Freeling had a couple good ones, but, I mean, I don't know. I think it's all Bob's doing.
Well, we all love the notorious P.I.G., the, greatest character of
everyone's favorite character. Yes, that's true. Because I think I saw on your letterbox you watched both the Space Jams, right? It's sort of like a comparison point for this movie.
Yeah. So I watched 3 movies kind of leading up to this because I wanted to get more. I was initially going to approach this from a more like Robert Zemeckis, but I kind of figured that I would do it from those kind of live action animation hybrids, especially because I haven't seen Space Jam, like the original one. I hadn't really seen it at all. At least all the way through. I had seen like bits and pieces, of course, but so I did that one and the sequel, and then I also watched Cool World.
Yeah, Cool World.
Yeah, I mean, I want to kind of talk about that a bit later as we get into the sort of the legacy of Who Framed Roger Rabbit, but
its new legacy, as it were, right?
The new for I feel like the longest time I associated Looney Tunes also with like Tom and Jerry, that same kind of style a bit. Those were kind of the two that I like kind of put together in my mind. But yeah, it is interesting. I wonder if like people who are slightly younger than me know about Looney Tunes besides kind of their just status as cultural, like pop culture icons, I guess.
Right, or more importantly, from people who, I don't know, might be their parents, who are just like, man, but Space Jam was the best. I saw it when I was 4, and therefore it's great.
Yeah, having no nostalgia attached to that movie at all is so fascinating watching it because, like, I think it's a fine movie. I think it's fine, but yeah, it's interesting, especially looking at all those 3 films I mentioned, and then watching Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and then just seeing the massive gap in quality between those. It's really interesting.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, with the Space Jam of it all, I will say, as someone who does have nostalgia for Space Jam in terms of actually just seeing it when I was young, you're very nice. Because I think that movie has aged like a fine milk from 1996. If you still had that somehow in your house. That movie's rough. But, we'll get into all that as we jump into our feature here of Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
This is the tale of an up-and-coming movie star named Roger Rabbit and a down-and-out private detective named Eddie Valiant.
Ooga booga!
Every moment they were together was a new adventure in trouble.
Hide me, Eddie! Please!
It's a motion picture about friendship.
Take it easy! Please, Eddie! Don't show me out! You're making a big mistake!
Love. Compassion.
All right, I'm sorry I yanked your ears.
All the time you yanked my ears?
Murder.
Marvin Acme. The rabbit cacked him last night.
Remember, you never saw me.
Sex.
I'd do anything for my husband, Mr. Valiant. Anything.
And violence.
Tunes gets him every time.
Touchstone Pictures and Steven Spielberg present a Robert Zemeckis film.
We Tunes may act idiotic, but we're not stupid.
Who Framed Roger Rabbit?
So Who Framed Roger Rabbit came out June 22nd, 1988, based on the novel Who Censored Roger Rabbit by Gary K. Wolfe. I've not read that novel, but everything I've heard about it makes it seem like, oh, okay, they just kind of took the basic premise and paid Gary K. Wolfe to, like, fuck off. And he even has said as much as, like, after this movie came out, any of, like, the sequel novels he's done to Roger Rabbit are all very much based on the movie, as opposed to there's stuff in the novel, from what I understand, where, like, they're not cartoon, like, short film characters, they're, like, comic strip characters, so their speech bubbles appear, and that's part, like, the evidence is, like, seeing a fading talk bubble, and it's like Roger Rabbit gets killed, quote unquote, and then it turns out he's a villain, all this stuff, and, like, the basic characters are all there, but, yeah, they just took that premise and ran with it.
Huh, interesting. Yeah, I've never read the book. I would be kind of curious to read it after seeing, like, the movie so many times.
While we're talking about writers, the writers who are credited here, Jeffrey Price and Peter S. Seaman. It's weird how they wrote this like movie, which we're going to talk about, is like an amazing movie. We both really love it.
Yes.
Where there's a reason it's under masterpiece for this particular miniseries. But their credits after this are fascinating. Where after this, it's Doc Holliday, which is the movie everyone says Cars is a ripoff of. Wild Wild West. Yep.
Interesting.
The Jim Carrey How the Grinch Stole Christmas.
Sure. An okay movie, I think.
We'll maybe talk about that at some point. That's a movie I have to confront. The Queen Latifah vehicle, The Last Holiday. And Shrek the Third.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's a weird, and it's both of them combined have that same.
Yeah, they are writing partners, yes. So they wrote
Okay,
all those
sure,
together.
yeah.
Yes, so they are both equal to blame. And Who Framed Roger Rabbit also is like their second credit, because they also had a movie called Trenchcoat that they wrote.
Never heard of this.
Never heard of it either. Have no idea. Margot Kidder stars. Okay, interesting.
Sure.
But anyway, so it's amazing that I think, those guys who have not continued to prove their value as screenwriters, quite frankly, wrote this amazing movie. But I think a lot of that has to obviously do with a lot of the people involved behind the scenes. Because obviously this movie is produced by our patron saint Steven Spielberg.
Yes.
Right? And also like Frank Marshall and Dean Cundey is the cinematographer.
Dean Cundey shot it. Yes, of course. Cinematographer of like Halloween, of course, and like The Thing and Jurassic Park. And
also Camp Rock.
And Camp Rock, a masterpiece that will...
And Jack and Jill.
Of course. Oh my God. That's really...
It's really sad. The Dean Cundey, like, post, like, 95 career is a lot of, like, oh, no. You shot that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the last things he did shoot was Home Again. The, like, the Myers... Nancy Meyers' daughter.
Right.
Yeah, her the movie
with
she
Reese
made.
Witherspoon, yeah.
Yeah, that's so weird. And this movie looks incredible, as many, like, as all Dean Cundey shot movies around this time do.
Well, and that's also, of course, partially credited to, of course, our director here, Robert Zemeckis.
Robert Zemeckis, yes.
Is a very fascinating figure as well. Kind of in a similar vein to Dean Cundey. Where just the 80s run is amazing. I think most of the 90s run's pretty amazing, but there's one crucial step that I think will ruin him later. How do you feel about Robert Zemeckis?
Like, I've seen some of his movies, but I have not seen others. Like, I've seen all the Back to the Future movies.
Yeah.
Obviously, I've seen Forrest Gump. I grew up kind of around the perfect time for his kind of experimental animation, like, what would you call that? The
mocap,
Polar
zombie,
Express.
dead eyes, right?
Yes. So like I grew up watching Polar Express like every year, like that sort of like last day before Christmas break like thing. Yeah, but I have not seen like Death Becomes Her, which I've heard is great, or like I've seen like an hour of Castaway, but I haven't seen the full thing. And the thing, I like him. I would like to revisit the Back to the Future movies because I liked them a lot when I watched them, but I've only seen them once.
Yeah.
I absolutely despise Forrest Gump. I really don't like that movie at all. And yeah, but he's such a fascinating director to look at. And like, I mean, I did watch his Pinocchio movie recently, which is a fucking disaster in so many ways. But it is so interesting to go back to this period where he's just belting out bangers, of course. Like, he makes this in between Back to the Future 1 and 2, which is so crazy. And yeah, he's fascinating, but I can't say I love him. I don't know. How do you feel about Robbie Z?
Bobby Z.
Bobby Z.
Bzem. I think the trouble is that like I really grew up like loving a lot of his like pretty much anything from like the Back to the Future movies, or even Romancing the Stone. Actually, I remember seeing that too as a kid. Like Romancing the Stone through, I would say, like, unfortunately, Forrest Gump. And I've talked about this elsewhere of how I basically grew up in the era where Forrest Gump was considered like, oh, this is one of the great movies. You know, it's just like Citizen Kane.
Yes.
12 Angry Men, and then fucking Forrest Gump.
Forrest Gump.
And the weird sort of like seeing it fairly recently and realizing I was kind of brainwashed by a cult to believing that was a good movie. It's fascinating. But yeah, I think he's the classic example really of like a guy who, when you see his earlier movies, even like I Want to Hold Your Hand or Used Cars, he is like so already at that point perfect at like his comedic timing. The lack of like great looking comedies, I think, is like because you don't have people like a Zemeckis who like really understand like character comedy and how even like no matter how silly, especially in the case of say this movie
Or Looney.
no matter how silly our universe is, all of the characters have to believe it 100% and just really invest in it and make like these movies look so good that the jokes just like work even better because of just how like crystal clear like every shot is, like how he builds up suspense even with his comedy. Like the ending of Back to the Future is the best example of that, with like Doc trying to like get the wires together and like, oh no, they fell, I gotta go down the clock tower. He just knows how to like make every single comedic beat work at the same time for the story. And then after a certain point, after Forrest Gump, there's still like, I like Contact a lot, and I think Castaway's great. But then when he gets to that 2000s, it just becomes so much more about like, well, I helped revolutionize technology to make my great movies. So now I'll just keep revolutionizing technology and the movie's quality will come second. Because the technology part's the important thing. And he just got too obsessed with his toys. It's a bummer.
He does. And even when he goes back to making like a real movie, which is like would be Flight, I guess.
Yeah.
It's like not that great and is kind of like being held up by, you know, one of the most compelling actors to ever be on screen, Denzel Washington. Like most of that movie is just Denzel's performance.
Yeah. Well, don't forget that John Goodman also came in with a ponytail to Sympathy for the Devil.
That's true. I'm just remembering what he looks like in that movie, and it's insane. For anyone listening, don't watch Flight. Just look up clips of John Goodman in Flight, and you're good.
Honestly, also just watch the trailer, and you've pretty much seen Flight.
That's true, also.
And you're good. You don't have to waste, 2 hours and 20 minutes? The movie's so unbelievable.
It's a very long movie. Yeah, because the flight sequence is, at the beginning of the movie, and I'm like, oh, okay, that's interesting. And then I check the time, and I'm like, oh, there's an hour and 40 minutes left. What the fuck is in this movie?
And that's the one bit where he uses technology, and it's the best part of the movie. It is easily
the best part of the movie.
It's a very well done, horrible plane crash sequence. But yeah, and I think it's because he just learned the wrong lessons from stuff like Back to the Future or this, where this is an infamous movie in terms of the incredible amount of effort to make it happen. It's one of the rare examples to me that I still feel for a movie, even of my childhood or anything, where it's so rare to get movie magic movies where you were legitimately how the fuck was this done? And I've seen so much behind the scenes stuff of this movie. Yet every time I watch the movie, I'm still just how in the fuck did they do this? This is insane.
Yeah, and I mean because all three movies we mentioned before, the Space Jam, the terrible sequel, and Cool World, all those come after this movie.
Yes.
And none of them look as good. Not even close. And there's so many parts in this movie that even watching it I mean, how old is this movie? Almost 40 years old?
I think
right?
I think it's 35 years because it's
35?
2013 to 88.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. It is still one of those movies that you watch and you're just I don't know how they did this. It blows your mind. And there's it is also, it's in the tiny things, and I think it's the scene where Eddie Valiant and Roger are in the office.
Yes. And
Roger moves the chair, and his fingertips leave on the chair.
Yes, his prints are right there on the dust. Yes.
Yes, and it is this weird thing of it looks perfect. It basically looks perfect. There's so many moments in this movie like that.
I mean, and you can see there are attempts with say a Space Jam to kind of make some of these things work. The big thing in this movie to me, every time I watch it, that really astounds me, is realizing for any of these animated characters, they had to lay down an obvious basic animation. But then ILM had to go in and be oh, let's match the lighting and the shadows and everything, and have these special effects animation things that are not computerized. This movie is the only computers really used in this were to make props trigger so they can move in a certain way.
Right,
so,
right.
For shit the Baby Herman is a great example of that. Where if you see any behind the scenes stuff, it's him with the cigars in his hand, and if you watch the dailies of that day, it's a robot with an arm that moves like this that they just animated over. It really is it's from a time when you could actually watch a making of video that looked cool.
Sure. Yeah.
And it wasn't just a guy sitting at a computer typing buttons and here's an armature that we made of Roger Rabbit.
It's George Lucas? He's the one doing that?
I showed Steve this. I wanted to show him, like, you can make a sequel now.
We mentioned Spielberg, and it is interesting that this is kind of the era of where Spielberg is kind of gets to do whatever, basically. He's made the classic films that kind of, define that early period. And, I mean, I don't know, what in your sort of behind-the-scenes footage, like, how much of that did you find of Spielberg kind of trying to get this thing made and helping Bobby Z out?
Well, yeah, I think the fascinating thing also, there's so much context to this fucking movie. Because the big thing about this movie as well is, like, not just, like, the creative, like, labor that had to go into it, but also the timing of it. Where it just really could not happen any other time than, like, specifically 1988. Because there's the Spielberg thing you mentioned, where he not only directed all those movies, but also had become a big producer. Because this is, like, peak Amblin period of, like, he had produced, like, Poltergeist and The Goonies and, like, Back to the Future, obviously. So, like, he is in Bobby Z's corner, obviously, and, like, helping him out with, like, the big thing that everyone says is that he was the reason why all the companies willingly said, like, yeah, sure, you can use the Looney Tunes or the Fleischer cartoons or whatever, because he, like, everyone wanted to be in the Spielberg business at that time. So, like, yeah, sure, you want to do a movie with us after this as a favor? That, combined with the fact that this is a Walt Disney production, and infamously in the 80s, like, and pretty much from, like, 67 or so after Walt Disney died, all the way to, like, when The Little Mermaid came out, or so. They were in a rough spot. Like, they had just done The Black Cauldron, and, of course, one of my favorite fucking dumb corporate heads of a company ever, Michael Eisner and Jeffrey Katzenberg, hop on board from Paramount, and had worked with Spielberg, of course, on the first two Indiana Jones movies. They were running it. Eisner was, for sure, and Katzenberg was somewhere at Paramount. I don't know. Point is, they're at Disney now, and they are trying to, like, reshuffle everything because, like, we gotta, like, get this working. They were also going to close down the animation arm. And they were trying to develop it for a while because there's, like, early test footage where you can see, like, a weird version of Roger Rabbit voiced by Pee Wee Herman himself, Paul Reubens.
Okay.
And they had gone through, like, different casting attempts and stuff. And then Robert Zemeckis, who I loved, apparently he offered his services to direct, like, all the way back in 82 when he'd only done, like, Used Cars and I Want to Hold Your Hand. Disney was like, no! Fuck off. We're not going with you. Make a hit. And he did. Two of them.
Yep.
One especially giant one. It really could only have happened, point is, at this particular time. Because after this point, you get, like, The Little Mermaid and the Disney Renaissance, and Disney would not ever want to do something this particularly risky at all.
We say, like, this movie could not have been made today. Obviously not in the way that people talk about, like, I don't know, like Pulp Fiction. There was, like, a tweet going around about, like, Pulp Fiction could never be made today or something. But it isn't like that. But it's a thing of, like, the fact that this movie prominently features a smoking baby, like smoking a gigantic cigar. Like, Disney would never release this now.
Or have, like, a character as overtly sexual as Jessica Rabbit, or have, like, so many, even, like, characters saying, like, damn and hell, animated characters. Or even, like, the gorilla at one point calls Eddie Valiant a wise ass. Like, that would never happen in a modern Disney movie.
No. I mean, just describing the plot of this movie in terms of the fact that it is about, like, California, like, real estate and, like, the freeway system and all of this stuff. It is such a bizarre plot for a movie, and it's such an insane movie that, it never, like, Disney today would never even consider releasing this.
No, they wouldn't. And I think, like, that only could come from just the desperation of where they were at that point.
Yeah.
Just the fact that it's like, all right, fine, you know what, we've got Spielberg in our belt, and we've got, like, this guy who directed Back to the Future, fine, we'll do it. I'm sure, like, we need something. It was like their Hail Mary pass, pretty much. Yeah. But, one other person we should mention from behind the camera, who doesn't really get enough credit for this movie, ever, is Richard Williams, who is a great Canadian-British animator who had worked under some of the people, like, his mentor was Wilt Call? I forgot. But he's one of, like, the 9 old men from Disney. Like, one of the original animators. Milt Call, that's it. But, yeah, so he had worked under him, but at the same time had, like, been very disillusioned with, like, the Disney machine and was, like, a rare renegade animator, which is something, I don't know, you can't really do since that costs so much money, usually. You gotta like
Yeah.
really show. And to be fair, he had done like before this, he had weirdly won a Best Animated Short Oscar for an adaptation of A Christmas Carol, that had aired on television first.
Right, released in 1971.
Yes, great version of that, by the way. I watched a lot of Richard Williams stuff sort of in prep for this, and I'll be talking about maybe one later in the show. Put a pin in that. But that guy is like such a fascinating sort of renegade animator in a way, because especially given how much he does not like sort of the Disney culture, but at the same time respects the animation so much, you can tell that through this movie where he definitely has a lot of attention to like either the old Tex Avery Warner Brothers style or various, honestly. They say Tex Avery in the behind the scenes a lot, but there's a lot of Bob Clampett and Friz Freleng, all the other people influence there, and the old like the classic Disney characters. But there's still a little bit more of that, oh, we're going to treat these guys like real characters, to the degree that they're also going to like do kind of slightly lascivious things, like as much as we can do for this PG rating. And I think that's like when he's in the same sphere as like Zemeckis and Spielberg, I would argue in that regard, like it's the perfect synthesis of creative voices.
Yes, it is. Because the animation in this movie is so incredible.
Yeah.
And is so beautiful. And, you know, a lot of these kind of live action animation hybrids now, the animation can feel very subpar to the live action stuff because, like, I mean, you mentioned it takes so much work to make one of these, and to make it look good, it takes a lot of time and a lot of money.
Yeah, which is why, like, this isn't the first movie to do it, but at the same time, any older movie where you see it, it's usually either a short film or it's like a scene. Like, there's I think it's Anchors Away, where it's Gene Kelly dances with Jerry the mouse from Tom and Jerry.
Okay.
And stuff like that. So it would like not be, this is the most ambitious possible thing, where there's like 48 minutes of animation, which is like half an animated movie basically, in this live action movie that's a period film that also is a massive special effects extravaganza.
Yes, and it's the decision as well, because like talking about Space Jam, for instance, like the animation and the way that those characters kind of move alongside the live action element, in that case Michael Jordan, it almost feels a bit rigid. And this movie, I love especially the Roger Rabbit's animation, because he will literally go anywhere in like a room that he like is in, and it's so unhinged.
It's not like Hanna-Barbera shit where it's like very clearly like bad, sort of like where they do one frame every 10 seconds kind of animation.
Sure. Yeah. They're not like restricting themselves in terms of like what they can do in the animation. It just feels so crazy.
Usually in animation, they tend to like animate with like they call it by twos, which is basically like for every 24 frames per second, you use 2 of like the same shot for like 2 seconds. So it's total like 12 pictures basically in a second, but they're just like repeated, because that creates enough of like the vision thing, as opposed to Richard Williams is like on ones. We're doing 24 pictures for this second. And I think that really shows with that fluidity that you're talking about. Even characters standing still, like one of my favorite cameos in here, Droopy Dog, who's voiced by Richard Williams, where like he is just
Really?
yeah, right. Yes, he apparently loved, that was his favorite like classic cartoon, so he just had the impression down pretty perfect.
That's awesome.
But he's just standing there and talking to someone, but there's still so much fluidity in just the way he stretches his neck. I'm like going down.
Yes. Yes. And I mean, even just like the I'm like the car. I don't know his name, but like the car.
Benny the cab, sir. You respect his goddamn
Yes.
name.
Yes, my apologies. Just the sort of like mini chase sequence that happens in this movie is so crazy that you have like this, you know, live action element of Bob Hoskins in an animated car, like being chased by live action car. It's such an insane.
Well, especially on a
sequence.
street with other cars that are moving. Even
Yes.
like just, that's the thing, is that they add enough of this detail. That was the whole like thing with the animation. Usually was just like, we have to do something where like you have to like believe the details in the background so that an animated character feels of a piece with like, yep, that's a cartoon cab driving Bob Hoskins through 1947 LA.
Yes. So I mean, where to begin with here? Should we talk about a bit of the cast, because it's a very interesting cast?
Yes, I want to talk about first because you mentioned Benny the Cab, And the most frequent voice actor here is Charles Fleischer, who is the voice of Roger, as well as Benny, as well as two of the weasels. He's Greasy and Psycho. You can probably guess.
Hell yeah.
They're very subtle designs. But I find that guy so fascinating because he's great as a voice actor in here. I think particularly, I noticed Brian's shocked. I think I know
I'm making
why.
a face.
Right.
So I'm looking at his filmography.
Yes.
And I'm realizing that, like, so the main thing that I guess I would know him from is from Zodiac.
Yes.
Because he has the basement scene. If you've seen Zodiac, you know what I'm talking about. He's the terrifying man in that scene. He's also in like other stuff, like in A Nightmare on Elm Street.
Yes.
He's in Rango.
Yeah.
That's crazy. I'm sorry, continue.
No, but I think that's what's fascinating. I was going to bring this up because, like, I think he works so well as a comedic voice actor, but anytime I see him in things, and I want to emphasize, if Charles Fleischer's listening, you're a very talented person. He looks terrifying. Like,
He does.
And he came up as a comedian, and I've seen, like, clips of him performing, like, you know, at different, like, award shows and stuff. Like, there's a clip of him giving the Best Achievement Award for this movie, the Oscar for Best Achievement in, like, animation. Him presenting that with Robin Williams dressed up as Mickey Mouse.
That's so cool.
But you just see the weird contrast where those guys came up together, but obviously Robin Williams is, like, a living cartoon character. He was back when, rest in peace. But, like, he just, versus Charles Fleischer, who is, like, kind of trying to match that energy, but is so much more, like, awkward. And especially, he leans very heavily into, like, the other part Robin Williams no one talks about it, but, like, all the voices he did, some of which were unsavory and shouldn't have been done by a white person. That kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And it's so weird because it's like, I think he works perfectly as a cartoon voice here, but, like, as you mentioned, he's perfectly cast in Zodiac because he's the most terrifying man who's ever lived. And even in, like, other things, like, I watched him in a TV special, like, for the 35th anniversary of Disneyland. And he, like, appears at different points as different, like, people. Like, he's butler at the Haunted Mansion, or he's driving the Jungle Cruise. And he's trying to be, like, funny, but also a terrifying specter over Disneyland. It's so weird. Point. I just think that he doesn't seem necessarily the part for, like, a silly rabbit.
No, not at all. But he kind of is great for, like, Benny the Cab, because there's that one shot where, like, it's when, like, it's at the end of the chase when, like, they have, like, a real car kind of swerve left out of, like, the way, and Benny the Cab's like, get out of my way, I'm driving here, and I'm like, that sounds like the man from Zodiac.
I would, like, of all these cartoons that are created for the movie, I would so watch a Benny the Cab series of cartoons.
Oh man, absolutely,
so funny. Especially, like, one of my favorite lines in the movie is, like, when they take him out of the Weasel's truck, and he just says, like, they picked me up for driving on the sidewalk. It was only for a couple miles. This feels like the perfect cartoon character.
Yeah, the bit where he, like, crashes, right, when, like, Doom, like, pours the dip onto, like, the road, and then he, like, crashes, and then he gets in the car with Roger, but he's, like, sitting like he's like not a car.
Like, he's driving the car, but also I love that he puts his headlights on, but not the car's headlights.
Yeah, that is such a great bit. I guess here's a question I was gonna ask you, actually. Do you have, like, a favorite bit in this movie, or a favorite sort of, like, comedic little moment that stands out to you?
I mean, that is tough because I think I have several different favorite moments of this movie. Not all of them comedic. There's genuinely stuff that tears me up, honestly. But I think if I had to pick a favorite, it's probably the moment after the opening cartoon starts, which the opening cartoon's great. It's the first thing they animated, and it's such a great encapsulation of, like, what those old, like, Looney Tunes shorts were. But then it's that moment where, like, the director opens the fridge and everything is live action. And it's an amazing technical shot, but it's also so funny that Roger's just sort of like, but look, I can give you stars. I want to give you birds.
Yeah, and I love the Baby Herman just, like, being like, oh, come on, we could have had that one. Come on, Roger, what are you doing? And then, like, he, like, just, like, storms off set. And yeah, there's so many great bits in this. I mean, my current Zoom background, which is, like, during that chase sequence where the Benny's like, pull that lever, and Bob Hoskins is like, what lever? And then it just says, this lever's stupid, and it points. I also love just the the bit of when he gets like the revolver, like the cartoon revolver, and all the bullets are like little animated characters.
Right, cowboy.
Which is something I love that.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. I think, like, another one, and I think this movie, whenever anybody talks about the various different properties, which we'll get into, you're like, here, everyone points out about, like, oh, Mickey Mouse and Bugs Bunny in the same shot together. My Zoom background currently. And, like, that's the, oh my god, I can't believe they're together. But the fucking Donald versus Daffy piano fight is so great. Because it has, like, such perfect timing for, like, any of those Looney Tunes cartoons on the animation alone. But then also the fact that they're dealing with real pianos. They're actually, like, breaking and cracking as they're, like, hitting each other over the head. It's so perfect. Also, it's just a genuinely funny, like, setup. But, like, of course these two would, like, battle this way.
Yeah, I love that he has that line of, like, does anyone understand what he's saying?
Or especially the bit where Daffy, like, is going crazy and his hair goes wild, and then he puts it back and he just has, like, a calm moment while, like, Donald has the cannon coming out.
Yeah. But that's also, like, a sequence where it's, like, one of those, like, how did they do this things? Because, like, he's, like, perfectly playing. He's playing the piano, like, you know, and you can see, like, the keys moving, and it's, you know, I'm not a piano player. I don't know if he's actually, you know, playing the notes that you hear, but it is just so impressive. And yeah, just them like pulling the pianos off stage. It's so, like, yeah, it's such a perfect comedic timing.
Yeah, I'd say for sure. But you know what? We've been talking about cartoons for so long. We gotta talk about our human, our main man.
Yeah.
The perfect man. Bob Hoskins.
Yes, literally the perfect man.
This is what the ideal image for a man is. What stopped you from looking like this?
Yeah, that's it. When he takes his shirt off and is like just a ball of hair with legs, I'm like, this is the ideal male body type. He's so great in this movie, and it's funny because I've never seen his. Have you seen his early, like, he was known for a lot of British gangster movies. Have you seen a lot of any of those movies?
I did just recently see Mona Lisa, which he did right before this, and got him an Oscar nomination. Okay. It's an amazing movie, and he's great in it. But I mean, I'd seen him also in other things, like he's in a couple of Terry Gilliam movies, like in Brazil. He's just one of the plumbers, ironically.
Oh, yes,
a while before.
Yes.
Of course, after this, I've seen like Super Mario, which is definitely also a movie I did kind of grow up with in terms of like the infamy of it. And it's so weird where, like, I had no idea he was British until much later than I would care to admit, honestly.
Yeah, I had the same thing because he does a perfect, you know, this kind of voice, you know, kind of old-timey and kind of rugged. You know, he's so good at that. And, yeah, I never knew he was British. He's such a great actor. I like Hook, and I think he's really great in Hook. This is an interesting thing I wanted to kind of mention, though, as we get to like the character of Eddie Valiant, is like who else was up for this role?
Yes.
Because there's some very interesting choices that I don't really think would have gone well. Would you like to list some of them off?
Well, I mean, their original choice was Harrison Ford, who was like Spielberg's especially main choice, but he was too expensive. Then there was like Chevy Chase and Bill Murray didn't have any interest. Eddie Murphy, who misunderstood the concept apparently and really regrets turning down that role. But then also, speaking of him again, Robin Williams, Robert Redford, Jack Nicholson, Sylvester Stallone, Edward James Olmos, Ed Harris, Charles Grodin, and my favorite, Wallace Shawn.
Yeah, I saw Wallace Shawn in here, and he's probably the only one on this list who could probably nail it. Because, like, yeah, like all these, but like all the comedians like Chevy Chase and like Murray and Eddie Murphy around this time, like I just don't think any of them would have been able to nail this as good as Bob Hoskins. I think Wallace Shawn would have been really interesting. But none of, like, Robert Redford makes no sense at all.
I would argue Harrison Ford makes some sense. I think Harrison Ford, in terms of like a gruffness, he can be comedic, but there's still like that. I think he would have gotten sort of like, I have to play the tragedy of this, and that's what'll make it funny. I would kill to see him do like that ending routine where he has to like dance and sing. That would be the best thing.
It would be great. Yeah.
But I agree with you that Hoskins is so perfect, I think, because, like I mentioned, he treats the drama of that character genuinely seriously. Like, you get the sense, even though he is, like, doing some silly things, especially during that, like, ending, it's only because, like, this guy, the sort of backstory that's unveiled in my favorite shot that doesn't involve cartoons in this movie, where basically there's a certain point after, like, he gets the initial, sort of, like, the picture's done and pisses off Roger. He ends up going back to his apartment, and he just looks over the photos that were developed that Dolores had dropped off, and it's like, oh, it's the old one from our Cancun trip, and it's, like, him and his brother. And then he, like, falls asleep drinking, basically, while the camera pans over the entire disc that reveals so much. And it's, like, great visual storytelling. Just gives you everything about, like, who he is, including, I love this headline. And I didn't really notice it until this watch of, on the newspaper, it says, Goofy cleared of spy charges. Which I want that. I want to see that adventure.
That one really killed me. Yeah, I would love to see, like a courtroom drama with Goofy.
It's just Bridge of Spies, but with Goofy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Gosh, I'm not a communist.
So many of the jokes, you might only see them for like a second, and they could be such throwaway jokes, but they stick with you because they're just like, they're so funny and just so like weirdly funny. Like, Goofy cleared of spy charges. Like, what a weird headline. I will say, like, all of that stuff feels very much in line with the movie. Like, the movie does a really great job of establishing the whole, like, toons live in this world, and this is kind of the rules that we have for them. And then, you know, of combining that with the real, quote-unquote, real, like, California of this time. It does such a great job of making it feel real. Like, this could be a real place.
Right. That truly conveys, like, that period tone, but at the same time, the aesthetics of all these cartoon characters, and even just the way they establish toons as, like, second-class citizens, basically. Where, like, they don't go too far and, say, pull a Bright with it, necessarily. They don't go that far with it. But they have little hints, like, the Ink and Paint Club is a great example of that, where that's based on, like, Cotton Club-style stuff.
Yeah.
With black performers and completely, like, white wealthy audiences. And it works so perfectly that, like, everything we get helps establish sort of the world building, as people love talking about currently. But it doesn't, like, really get in the way of the story. It just helps increase the story. Like, one of my favorite, I think maybe my favorite sort of cameo in this movie is Betty Boop. Not because I have any affinity for Betty Boop, really, beyond just, like, I know who Betty Boop is. I've seen, like, some clips of the old cartoons. But just the weird back and forth that she has with Eddie that implies, like, a history. Of like, yeah, Betty and I got up into some trouble, but like, I like this. You still got it, Betty. Actually, like, weirdly, like, warms my heart.
It's so sweet,
and also just it recalls there's a tragedy just because she's like the only black and white cartoon in the middle of this entire thing that's like lush with color, and it's weird. It's a joke that also sells the reality, and that there's so much that's gone on before you've even seen this movie.
Yeah, and I love that it kind of is playing a bit on the whole, like, silent movie stars when sound came into play. Kind of that whole... I love the way that it plays on that, and the minute she says that, you're like, oh yeah, that kind of, like, within the context of this world, it would make sense that, like, those silent black and white characters, like, wouldn't fit into the, you know, modern society. I also, like, a throwaway... Like, not a throwaway line, but a line I love is... I think it might be in the opening scene after that, like, opening cartoon, I think, is when someone says, like, they're toons, you can do anything to them and they'll survive. And it's this weird thing. I'm like, yeah, it's cartoon logic. Like, you can just drop pianos on them.
Right.
Nothing happens to them.
But at the same time, there's also a bit of, like, that judginess. Like, even R.K. Maroon's a great example of this. Where, like, he is shown, like, oh, look, I got Dumbo on loan from Disney. He works for Peanuts. Which is, like, it's a funny bit, it's a funny pun, but also it immediately gets you the idea of, like, oh, this guy just puts them on his contract. It's like, they're fun. They're not beings that have lives that I care about. They're just, like, these things. And then that shot where, like, after he leaves that office and he goes through and sees, like, all the different cartoons, like, just on the set, like, there's the cattle call for, like, all the cows. Which is, like, literally called the cattle call. Or even, like, just the fact that in that scene you see so much, like, the filmmaking where Robert Zemeckis famously was like, I'm moving the camera around, and because usually whenever they would do this kind of, like live action animation, the camera's, like, very still, and you're not moving it at all, you're not doing any kind of big movements. And so you have, like, little characters who you only see like the tops of. Like there's these weird like devil ones who are just walking by Eddie and getting in his way, and you just see like the tops of their heads because you don't need to show everything else off to like make that particular like camera move work, and it's amazing.
Yeah, that sequence where like it's like this like sweeping like shot of like the lot is so great because it is kind of that like it's almost similar to like the Star Wars thing of like background characters stand out so much, and like you could like watch Roger Rabbit and sort of pick out your favorite background character, like even in that sequence. It's so great,
and especially even just the random assortment of characters they got. Where, like, you see, like, obvious ones, like, oh, there's Clarabelle Cow. But then, look, there's the Fleischer Brothers clown. Someone who means nothing to anyone below the age of, like, 50 at this point.
Yeah, but it is, like, that like, love and care to these characters. And, yeah, like, the way, like, the RK Maroon character, like, you could almost say he treats them like IP in a way.
I wonder how that's relevant at all.
Yeah, this movie has no relevance to today in any way.
By the way, that actor Alan Tilburn, who's great, a perfect like salty Louis B. Mayer type of just like I smoke cigars and I'm like gonna die from lung cancer in like 10 years.
Yeah, what's the line he has when Eddie Valiant first walks into the thing when he's like looking through like the editing like screen and he says something like really funny where he's just like, no, the toon, you gotta drop a bigger piano. He says something like that.
Right. He's just
really
giving
great,
notes in the editing suite, basically, about a cartoon. I want to go back to Bob Hoskins. We kind of like diverted a bit from Hoskins.
Yeah.
Because like he plays all that sincerity, but also he's genuinely just like a great comedic straight man. Like the scene where him and Roger are like stuck in the speakeasy and he's trying to like saw off his handcuff is like could only work as well because every single element of that is like so perfectly synthesized, including Hoskins, who like basically like throughout this whole production is like talking to nothing. More common now, but at this time he's talking to nothing, and so at the same time you believe the eye line because the animation and him are like so in sync. You totally believe like the chemistry he has with Roger because Charles Fleischer was on the set, by the way, in a Roger Rabbit costume, which he insisted on in order to be fully immersed in the character.
That's amazing.
Yes. And all that, like, it feels so perfect, and it's all, like, starts, I would say, with Hoskins. It would not work at all without him being able to do that to the degree that, like, this is a best actor-worthy performance. It's genuinely, like, a brilliant performance from an actor.
I agree. Yeah, imagining him sort of having to act to nothing, basically, and how perfect he is in this movie, and every little comedic bit he's so great at that, and especially when we get to Toontown, like such a breathtaking sequence, and like the way that sort of sequence flows and how Bob Hoskins like reacts so perfectly to everything. I mean, like the scene that is your Zoom background with like Mickey and Bugs, his reaction is just so perfect. It is a really phenomenal performance. But we should also should we talk about Christopher Lloyd?
Fuck yeah, we should talk about Christopher Lloyd.
My favorite thing about Judge Doom and Christopher Lloyd is like he shows up on screen and you're just like, is this the bad guy? I wonder if this is the bad guy, because he's just, everything about him screams evil. Like he looks like just so the incarnation of like evilness.
Yeah, the costume design, the design of his spectacles, but even just also his performance, especially like when you see this movie after like the second time and you know that he's the toon, that twist, you just realize, oh, it makes so much sense. He feels like a cartoon character who is bottling up any of his cartoonish instincts, and he lets that come out occasionally. Like my favorite is when he's at like the bar and he like picks up a merry-go-round broke down, quite loony selection for a bunch of drunken reprobates. But then he like sniffs it, and then he just looks up like, he's here. Like that's a toon moment. That is a real like cartoony moment. And then also just even the design of like his fake teeth. They're like so obviously fake. That could only be just like, oh, this is a toon hiding with dentures.
Yes, his whole design is so unsettling. Where like I feel like this was a big like, especially his whole sequence at the end, which I've changed my Zoom background to, which is his eyes like popping out, which like I love that they become like daggers after this, like right after this, like this shot. I feel like that sequence is a very like too young to see how horrifying this is kind of moment for a lot of people.
I mean, he's responsible for two of them in this movie with that and the dip shoe thing, which is like often cited as like, oh, I saw this when I was like 5 and it fucked me up. I'll add to the chorus and concur with those statements, even though I watched this movie so many times, it still disturbed me every time.
It's so upsetting because he looks, the little shoe looks so sad, and it's just such an upsetting scene.
And trivia, that shoe, an early voiceover role for Miss Nancy Cartwright before she became Bart Simpson.
Oh, interesting.
Yes.
Huh. Very interesting. This would be right before The Simpsons, too. Huh.
I think it would have been like during the Tracy Ullman short days, basically. Like
sure,
this is
right.
like very early in that run.
Yeah, and I love the whole sequence where like he goes to the factory for the first time at the beginning of the movie, and there's so much setup for like the hammer that like the fist comes out of, and so much good setup that like pays off at the very end of the movie because you've already seen it. It's just one of those things that about this movie that's so great.
Yeah, and even just down to like the specifics of the gags there, stuff like the hole that's able to like go in the middle of the wall or whatever. But even like the Frank Sinatra sword is like exactly what every single like Looney Tunes cartoon would do for like a celebrity impression. Because I watched a bunch of Looney Tunes shorts in prep for this. They had it out for Frank Sinatra, man. There's like so many jokes. Like there's a one of my favorite ones that I watched recently was this one about like Porky Pig has a farm. And all of the hens are like laying eggs, but they stop after they leave production to go listen to a rooster who sings like Frank Sinatra sing, and all of them just shout like, "It's Frankie!" Like that's like even Bugs Bunny has done that too. Just like, "Oh, is that Frankie over there?" Like they really had it in, but it's the perfect kind of like joke that like I didn't get it all as a kid. I had no idea about like singing sword, and it's like, okay, I don't know who that is. But this movie has so many jokes like that. They're just like, oh, they have aged well with time.
Yeah. But
Christopher
Lloyd. His performance works so well in that, like, he's so menacing.
Yes.
And so just, like, he's genuinely terrifying is, like, the thing about him. And I don't know. Lloyd is just, he's selling it so well. I don't know. How do you feel about Christopher Lloyd? How do you feel about Christopher Lloyd in general?
I mean, Christopher Lloyd, like, because I grew up with, like, the Back to the Future movies and stuff, Christopher Lloyd was, like, one of the prime examples. Like, he's technically not that guy kind of character actor, because I would argue, like, most people would recognize at least, like, oh, that's Doc Brown. Like, if you have that distinctive a role, you're not technically a character actor, but he has such a great career of a character actor. Where you look at, like, you know, where he started, like, back in Taxi, or in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest when he's with Danny DeVito as well, in a very early role. But then, like, all of the different stuff he's done, he's one of those actors who's, like, so incredibly committed and can go wild, but doesn't do it, like, all the time. He knows how to play things subtly. He knows how to play things over the top. Even now, when Christopher Lloyd, like, cashes in on being Doc Brown again, like in a commercial or something, I can't be mad at him. You know? Get that money. You're still fun as him. Go ahead. Sure. Do it. Promote Nikes by being Doc Brown or whatever.
The sequence of him, like, where he gets flattened by, like, the big machine at the end and then, like, reinflates himself is so creepy and so, like...
And the only bit of stop motion in the movie.
Oh, interesting. Right, yes. Yeah. And that's kind of one of the things about this movie where it is this whole, like... You know, like we mentioned, like the shoe scene of being like kind of very scary for like younger children. But a lot of what I love about this movie is the way that it doesn't treat animation and these characters, even though they're animated, it doesn't treat them in a juvenile way or doesn't like treat them like they are like just for kids, like, you know, that kind of thing. And, you know, but isn't also like the kind of edgy sort of like cool stuff that we get in Cool World, which is just so like cringy and terrible. It all just works so well.
Well, especially when I think the big line between that is you mentioned Cool World with Hollywood, one of our favorite female cartoon characters, but even Jessica Rabbit, where obviously, you know, the big hurdle with this is like Disney being like, you can't have like a character this sexual. in like a Disney movie in theory, but because of now it's like, fine, do whatever, we're desperate. But Jessica Rabbit is somebody who like initially feels like, and you know, if you go to certain parts of the internet, they have one sort of point of view about Jessica, but I like that Jessica actually feels like an interesting character where like she has like dignity about her life. She loves her husband genuinely over like a personality trait of like, he makes me laugh, which is great.
I love that line. It's one of my favorite lines in the entire movie because it is like this thing where where Bob Hoskins' character, he's legitimately just like, why this fucking clown? And she's just like, yeah, he makes me laugh, and it's so sweet.
Yes, and she feels like a bit more complex as a character than I think people give her credit for. Even though at the same time she's a hilarious caricature of like bombshell sexuality of that particular period.
Yes.
Where that's the thing with like her and Benny the Cab and Roger Rabbit, they all feel like characters who would have probably existed in this like era of animation, where you have like more animation studios doing shorts and stuff. And Roger Rabbit even feels in his own way, because Richard Williams even said this, that like, oh, he's got like the ears of Bugs Bunny, but then like the gloves of Mickey Mouse, and like the overalls kind of were called Goofy, stuff like that. He's an amalgamation to where I could believe that like there were some studio made a Roger Rabbit type character who was a ripoff of so many different cartoons and tried to make him work. Roger even feels like he's sort of more like a B-list character because he looks up to Goofy and other things. So like that works. But at the same time, I love even the weird thing where Jessica, but also Betty Boop with like the "what a lucky Goyle" bit implies that like maybe Maroon just like does this because he's a weird toon sex symbol. Which is the funnier thing to me. It's just that, like, all of, like, we can't, like, all the Lady Tunes want to see Roger Rabbit cartoons. It's such a big industry for us. It's a specific niche market.
Yeah. I love, like, the line at the very end that Jessica has to Roger where she's like, Roger, you were amazing. Much better than Goofy.
Well, especially when she's like, my hero, and then knocks like Eddie out of the way, just like, oh, Roger, you was so brave.
Yeah.
Which, shout out, we should admit, Kathleen Turner in an uncredited voiceover performance, interestingly enough, as Jessica.
Huh. Interesting.
Who's like the perfect person to like play a sort of noir femme fatale type character.
Yes.
In terms of at least the red herring of her character. Yeah, she's amazing. Also, former Miss Steven Spielberg, Amy Irving, does the vocal performance during the Ink and Paint Club scene.
Oh, interesting.
It's just leave them the temp track and they used it. But that's a great example also, what we've been talking about this whole time. Like, everything just synthesizing so well with, like, that number. Like, the fact that Jessica interacts with everybody where, like, she grabs ties. She makes that one guy, like puts her hand on his forehead. Even the way she, like, gets out the handkerchief for Marvin Acme and, like, shines his bald head and stuff like that. It just is like an amazing example of like, it's a funny parody of like those kind of scenes in like noir movies, or like a sort of cartoon version of like a noir movie, but it also has like such technical wizardry that's just casual. Like, this movie is like a very casual flex of every single person involved.
It is. It absolutely is. And like, one of the things I was thinking about, and I kind of mentioned how like expressive all the animated characters are, like they feel like they could be in one of those like old shorts, is like, you know, it's a movie made in 1988, and like you would think that like it would start to age a bit, but I do think that because the characters are just so well animated, and there's nothing like, that sequence you mentioned with Jessica Rabbit is not flashy necessarily in any way. It's almost quite simple in like, it's just her like, you know, kind of, you know, doing a performance and having little interactions with these characters, and it looks so great still to this day.
And then even when there's a couple details, like the only time I notice it is like when you have, say, there'll be foreground shots where you have like one of the weasels putting dip in, and then you have Roger and Jessica like in the way background during the finale. Like, they look a bit like, oh, they obviously focus all their animation on the two characters in the foreground, but also, like, they spent 14 months animating this fucking movie. Like, they shot this movie in, like, 86 and then spent over a year animating it.
Yeah, that's absolutely insane. It is one of those things where, like, it's like, it's movie magic. It's that sort of thing where you just like, it makes no sense how they did this, even if you've like seen behind the scenes footage or whatever. Like, it's perfect in so many ways.
Yeah, they're able to do the small stuff. That's what Zemeckis always kind of emphasizes. Like, if we get these small details right, everyone will love this. Like, that the weasels hold live action guns.
The one with like the Thompson is so funny to me. The way that they just shoot the door down. It looks so funny that they're like holding like real revolvers and
that was done by literally having like little like marionette strings for like them. So there's somebody like up there fucking like with a giant marionette string going around. Or even like the Ink and Paint Club is built on like 8 foot above the ground, so guys can be around with like little like sticks that have the trays on them for the penguins to carry.
Oh my god, that's so crazy. And it is like it is also this kind of thing that like with the sort of bad versions of these kinds of movies that like that sort of like actual work and sort of like actual technical ability is not really like the work isn't put in as much with a lot of the movies that come after this, which are trying to sort of do the same thing.
Well, I wouldn't argue necessarily work as much as just like time allotted to workers.
Right, yeah, that's
like,
what I mean.
Clearly,
yeah.
the bigger problem, where it's just like like I said, they had over a year to animate this, which even for a lot of anime movies isn't like a massive amount of time, but it's more than like the crunch time, especially a lot of computer animators get at this point, which is like this comes out in 2 months, fucking finish it. By the way, we haven't mentioned this because of the weird sort of schedule for our recording, but this is recording not too long after the actors and writers strikes have like officially combined.
Yep.
And I think it's fair to say we support that, especially for, like, say, a movie like this. We support entertainment workers getting fair rights. Toons or not.
It is. Just the sort of modern day parallels of, like, the entertainment industry. Just all of that stuff is so interesting and has just aged in such an interesting way. But even, like, the whole, like, Chinatown-esque, like, subplot.
Yes.
Of sort of like Cloverleaf, I believe it's called, right?
Right, not Cloverfield. There's no Clover monster.
Not Cloverfield.
Animated in 2D in this movie, no.
Of like Cloverleaf trying to take over like the public transportation system so that they can make the freeway system. I mean, like the speech that Judge Doom gives at the end, where he's like, "It will be beautiful, and there will be billboards everywhere."
My favorite part of that is Christopher Lloyd saying, "Tire salons!"
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And it's so interesting to like watch this movie and look at that and sort of to listen to that speech and sort of look at the modern day infrastructure of like the US, and it's like, yeah, everything kind of looks like Christopher Lloyd is, like Judge Doom is describing in that scene. That's kind of that's the hell we live in now.
Well, even then, like, this is actually based on, like, actual events, because back in the 30s, LA did actually have, like, a robust public transportation system with, like, electric cars that went everywhere. And, after, like, 1950 or so, they were bought up by mainly a lot of, like, oil companies and shit like that, who just dismantled these electric public transportation systems and put in buses. And that's how we get, like, the modern, sort of infrastructure of transportation, which this movie is, like, a sort of Quentin Tarantino alternate history, where it's like a Toon did it, and we got rid of him, so it didn't happen, and Toontown is great, and we go on average roads now.
Yeah, I love the line. It's when he's catching, like, the tram car or whatever with, like, the kids, and he's like, who needs a car in LA? We have the fastest public transportation in the world. It's such a funny line to think about now, where it's like LA is notorious for its like terrible traffic.
Right, where every stand-up comedian after like 1975 is doing that joke about LA traffic. It's the worst.
I love that plot line, and it's so fascinating because I feel like when you first watch the movie, you're not really paying attention to any of that stuff. Like, especially like when they go to the theater and they're playing like the sort of like commercial ad thing, talking about, or like the newsreel. But like when you rewatch it and sort of pay attention to that stuff, it's like the contrast of that in this sort of like cartoon world is so interesting, and yet like adds, I think, so much weight to the actual, like, it sounds so funny to say world building in this, like, with this movie, but like the world building of this movie,
which also adds to even just like another great thing about Zemeckis in his prime, a master of setup and payoff. Just a absolute master of like making the setup feel casual, like the opening, say, of Back to the Future 1 with like Doc Brown, where it's like, oh, we're focused on like the dog food thing going, but we're getting stuff about the plutonium. We're getting all these indications that he was like a weird scientist man who was kicked out of his world and stuff like that. He just feels like such a perfect example of like, if we make this once again, like we just put this here and we trust the audience to like figure out the exposition on their own, put 2 and 2 together, then like we can make this world feel so massive and big.
Yeah, it's so great.
You know, another thing I wanted to talk about in terms of sort of like the place and time of this movie, a big thing, and this can probably transition at least us into talking about sort of the IP of it all. This is one of the last, I think the last time Mel Blanc, who did the voices of like nearly every Looney Tune, did his voices before he dies in 89. So like this is like the absolute last possible thing. He like I think he's in like the Jetsons movie or something, so that came out afterward. But this is like the last time he played all these classic characters. And as someone who likes those Looney Tunes shorts, it's really hard watching a lot of the last days of Mel Blanc voiceover talent. Because like that's even another thing, is that the Looney Tunes were also in like a desperate state at this point, where this is around the time where they've stopped making theatrical shorts and they're putting like these package films together where they have some dumb wraparound that's poorly animated by like, you know, an aged Chuck Jones and Friz Freleng about like, oh look, Bugs is a genie and he's granting wishes, and the wishes correspond with old cartoons that are very poorly edited together to fit like a 75-minute movie. So like rough era.
Yeah.
Right. But in this movie, it like sounds great. Every single character sounds like perfect. It's like a wonderful swan song to like an amazing voice acting career.
Yes. Yeah, it really is. And like, I mean, yeah, and I mean, sort of talking about this, obviously the Looney Tunes characters and then the Disney characters, which like they show up at like the very end. And like, it's so interesting to look back on this now, especially as I have like a few days ago just watched Space Jam: A New Legacy, which is like one of the worst offenders of like, you recognize this character? Hey, that's a character right? That's cool, right? You like that. And this movie, again, like you have the parachuting sequence, which is like a moment where it's like, oh hey, these two characters are like in this movie, but it doesn't feel like shoved in. Like the scene serves a purpose where it's like them messing with Bob Hoskins about the parachute, and it's like a tire. It's just so it's so great.
And there's a clear respect for those characters, like you mentioned earlier, where just like every single character feels in character, like Tweety Bird, where it's just like, oh, piggies. And then also, I love that he just says like, hi, Tweety. Like, oh, they know each other. They're buds from way back. But yeah, just like there's a true respect for those characters instead of like, and you say a Space Jam: A New Legacy, where they try and do that with like, oh, here are all these Warner Brothers film live action characters mostly in the background, but without any understanding that like, I don't think the nuns from The Devils and the Droogs from Clockwork Orange would want to watch a basketball game. I don't think they have much interest in that.
Yeah, oh my gosh. I want, we'll briefly talk about Space Jam: A New Legacy, but like,
I think we have to, like, in relation to this.
It might be one of the worst movies I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah.
And I do not like use that lightly. I genuinely don't think a movie has made me angrier than Space Jam: A New Legacy. In relation to this movie especially, the fact that for the main climax of the movie, these characters aren't even in 2D animation, that they are like these ugly little 3D things, and there's just no respect for any of like the characters. And like when like Looney Tunes characters show up in this movie, it feels great, like we've been talking about. But then in Space Jam: A New Legacy, it's like it is nothing. It's absolutely nothing.
Because those characters are only sort of recognized in terms of, oh, you were in the first Space Jam that fucking millennials are nostalgic for. That's the only reason they're there. There is no care and attention, as opposed to, say, like, a movie I rewatched in prep for this, Joe Dante's Looney Tunes Back in Action, which was sort of in between those two, which isn't a great movie. You can tell, like, Joe Dante had a lot of, like, infamous studio executive, like, meddling with that particular movie. But the consistent thing is the Looney Tunes are the Looney Tunes. And you can tell that he has a respect and a love for those characters. There's an amazing sequence that feels like a great Looney Tunes short where, like, they go into the Louvre and they jump from painting to painting. So they go through, like, the Scream and shit like that. That's a fun, like, idea that comes from somebody like, I grew up loving the Looney Tunes, as Joe Dante has expressed many times. And it's such a bummer that, like, that is truly, I think, the last time I think Looney Tunes will be anywhere near recognizable to what they used to be. Because I think just in the 20 years since, it's just been a lot of, like, they don't know what to do with these characters. Like, there were those CG shorts, too, at one point, that, like, they put out in, like, the early 2010s and stuff like that. It just feels like they're kind of like the Muppets of Warner Brothers, where it's like, I mean, I don't know, put them on a t-shirt in the Space Jam 2.
They feel more like merchandise and sort of like, again, like they feel like Warner Brothers is like using them as like IP, as like you recognize these characters not as characters but just as like everyone knows Bugs Bunny. You can ask like any fucking person on the street and they will know who Bugs Bunny is, like even if they've never seen Looney Tunes. And yeah, that feels like what they're sort of doing now, which is so sad.
I mean, they're treating them, quite frankly, how most of the time Disney treats Mickey and Goofy and Donald,
right.
Like that main staple is just like mascots who are here. And
yes, mascots,
to be fair though to Mickey Mouse, I will at least say those recent sort of like flash animated shorts that they've been doing over the last like decade or so with like Paul Ruddish for Mickey Mouse have been really fun, and they feel like they're actually treating Mickey as like a cartoon character with like liveliness and stretchiness. I would recommend if anybody like has any interest in animation, those shorts are very fun.
Right. I mean, and I guess while we're on this kind of subject of like these other movies, I like a thing that I think really like cements this movie as like not just a masterpiece, but also like this sort of like lightning in a bottle moment for cinema is that like this movie comes out and it, like you said, it's not the first movie to do this sort of live action animation hybrid, but it's certainly the first one to do it to this scale, if I'm not mistaken. And yet none of the movies I had, the one I didn't get to watch was Looney Tunes Back in Action, but I might still watch that.
I don't know. I mean, you have a Joe Dante deficit that is going to be fixed by this podcast, I think.
I do.
That's a mission I have.
Yes, I have not seen a single Joe Dante movie, including Gremlins. I've never seen Gremlins, but yes, I would love to go watch more Joe Dante movies. But a thing that like cements this movie as like just like perfect lightning in a bottle is that none of the movies that come after this, whether it's like Space Jam or Cool World, which we should probably talk about that one next, none of them get what makes this movie perfect right. Like none of them do it right. And I think that is sort of a hallmark of how great this movie is overall.
I think another big element that we haven't really talked about that much, you kind of referenced it, it's just that this movie also just really works as a solid noir story. Like, they obviously are cribbing from, like, Chinatown and stuff, but this was, I think, the movie that, like, introduced me to, like, noir tropes of any kind. Where I was just like, I like the hard-boiled detective, the initial sort of like, oh, we're having a red herring crime that all of a sudden like gets turned around with like a murder that happens, all this other stuff.
The jazzy score.
Oh my, Alan Silvestri's score in this movie is one of my favorite scores of all time. It's that perfect meld of jazz and the loony stuff, and it's just genuinely like heartfelt and affecting. I love that score. But anyway, how do you feel about this in terms of like, I guess we haven't talked about this much. Are you a noir fan in general? And do you feel this works as a solid neo-noir in its own right?
I've seen a few of them. I think I've mentioned to you before, I'm very interested in like the sort of the neo-noir, but the like the slacker detective. I like that sort of stuff.
The Long Goodbye.
The Long Goodbye, Inherent Vice, of course, is one of my favorite movies.
The Raymond Chandler type detective, as it's often, who originated that kind of trope,
I like that sort of thing. And I've seen a few noir classic kind of black and white noir films, and I mean it's that thing that I was kind of mentioning earlier where it's like the noir plot of this movie contrasted with the Looney Tunes energy literally of this the characters and everything. They complement each other almost, right? Because the noir plot adds weight and adds kind of like you become invested in like what's happening with these tunes, and it is a very solid noir. I love like the very like noir shot of like it's like his door and you see like the shadow with like the hat, like the silhouette, a very kind of classic noir shot. I love a great conspiracy sort of noir like this. It works really well, I think.
Yeah, and it's like you said, it also just adds a genuine amount of like curiosity with the plot, and I think it also makes certain other things work. Like the underrated people in this movie that hear no one talk about because they're not cartoons or whatever, but they're great. I love all the patrons at the bar. The
Yes.
regulars that pop up, which also Joanna Castile also is Dolores. Great classic
Yes.
like noir kind of like dame who talks like this kind of deal. She does that so perfectly. But like all the guys where it's like there's the guy who only writes on the pad, or the vet who has one arm, or Angelo, of course, or my favorite, the guy no one talks about but I think is amazing. That motherfucker who's just dressed up as a cowboy in the back.
Yeah.
Wearing what looks like Marty McFly's like Western outfit he initially wears in Back to the Future 3 with like the tassels and shit.
Yeah, there's so many great little, like, all those characters are so great. I love when they sort of just laugh at Doom when he shows up. Like, they sort of, I forget the joke that they say to him, but they just like kind of laugh in his face.
Well, I mean, even like the Angelo setup, which is amazing, with like that guy who's the bar patron, who is just like, oh, let me guess, little Bo Peep, she's lost a sheep and you're trying to find
Yes.
him. That guy who's so great, but he works so perfectly. Like that whole sequence adds tension by just having like this guy who seems like an asshole earlier, and it's like, oh, is he actually gonna protect Roger because he made him laugh or not? And then the Harvey joke, like that's great. It's a funny bit, but it also like helps to establish that like, oh no, that sort of power of laughter that this movie talks about a lot, of just like, oh, our only purpose is to make people laugh kind of deal. It weirdly permeates where it's like, yeah, you know what, laughter does work. That thing that comedians talk about all the time, it brings us together, actually works in this case.
Yeah, the line that he had, it's when like they're in the little like the hidden room, and when he's like sawing off the thing, and Roger just kind of slips out of it and goes, and Eddie Valiant's like, you mean you could have done that this whole time? And he just goes, well, only when it was funny. And admittedly, it's very funny timing when he does do it.
Yeah.
Should we talk about Cool World? Because I've been thinking a lot about this movie in relation, especially to Roger Rabbit.
Yes.
Well, can I set up what Cool World is, by the way, just in case anyone doesn't know what it is out
sure.
there?
Explain. Give people a primer on this long forgotten movie.
Yeah, so this was a movie released in 1992, starring, of course, Kim Basinger, Gabriel Byrne, and Brad Pitt. An early Brad Pitt performance, kind of right around the time he's in like Thelma and Louise, I think. And it's directed by Ralph Bakshi, who I have not seen, unfortunately. I haven't seen any of his other films. Like I know he did the what's that movie, Wizards? That has like really interesting aesthetic.
And the like 70s Lord of the Rings rotoscoped movie, stuff like that.
Right, yes. But this is a movie where Gabriel Byrne is a cartoonist who has been put in prison for, I guess, killing a guy or something.
Yeah.
And he created this comic called Cool World, which is, I'd be curious if you agree with me. The vibe and the kind of the that I'm getting from like Cool World is like edgy 90s animation. And it feels like a bit of what like The Simpsons would parody in terms of like cartoon violence. It feels a bit like that. Like how would you describe like the vibe of the Cool World, like those kind of animation sequences?
It feels like weird graffiti on a strip club wall.
That's a good one, actually.
That's really
Yes.
the vibe I get off of Cool World. It's that lasciviousness you're talking about, but it's not, because that goes in way too far of the other direction from like a Space Jam, where like their whole thing is like, oh, we gotta be the squeakiest clean possible and have no kind of like rough edges to us, pretty much at all.
Sure.
Versus Cool World is like, we are all rough edges, and there is
Yes.
nothing engaging about this on any level except like, isn't it fucked up this is happening? And like I mean,
Yes.
we did an episode of Double Edged Double where we talked about that like way back, but that was an example also of like Ralph Bakshi did not want to do that movie. He wanted to do like this
Yes.
weird, fucked up like horror movie, basically about
Can I
like
describe?
yes, describe
Can I
this.
please describe what Cool World was supposed to be?
Yes,
So, the plot of Cool World was supposed to be that, very similar to what the movie is Gabriel Byrne is a cartoonist, creates this world called Cool World. He's in prison. It was supposed to be, and please feel free to chime in whenever if I get something wrong. But so he does basically this whole movie is conceived as like, so everyone kind of wanted to like fuck a cartoon at some point, right? And so it was supposed to be that Gabriel Byrne's character does conceive a child with the Hollywood character.
Yeah.
And the child is like half animated, half live action.
Yeah.
And so I guess the plot was supposed to be that the child grows up and escapes the cool world and sort of resents their father for like leaving, I guess, and goes on a quest to kill their father in the real world.
Yeah, just like it takes down humanity.
Just
Apparently,
so
it was gonna be like basically a slasher movie with a half human, half cartoon.
Yes, it sounds insane, and is so much more interesting than what the actual movie is, which is that like Brad Pitt plays a character who has just come home from World War II in the 40s, and he like shows his mother his new motorcycle, his Harley Davidson, and he takes her on a trip with it on the road, and she dies in a car accident, and right after she dies, a little animated scientist like beams him to the cool world. And so then we get the introduction of the Gabriel Byrne character in the 90s. He's in prison. Gets let out of prison.
Somehow has an easel while he's in prison so he can keep making his cartoon.
Right, he's in like a normal prison, but they've given him like an animator's room, which makes no sense because I'm like, what? Like, yeah. And then so just the implication that like Brad Pitt's character has been stuck in the cool world for 50 years is insane. And the movie establishes the only rule of the cool world, and they specifically say the only rule is that the human characters and the animated characters cannot have sex, and that's exactly how it's put.
Yep. As Brad Pitt says, just like literally, like it is illegal for a human to have sex with a toon, and 7-year-old Thomas is very confused by what this means.
Yes, and 25-year-old me is also very confused by what this means.
Yes. That's the thing. It doesn't get any better as you age. It's like, oh no, this ages poorly. And it wasn't good to start with.
No. And we should also mention, like, the animation is very shoddy.
Yeah.
There are, like, weird moments where, like, Brad Pitt and this animated Kim Basinger will just have a conversation, but, like, these little, like, kind of cartoon characters will just run across screen and, like, do something, but they're in, like, a private room.
And you can see the edges of the animation cell where it cuts off and shit's very poorly cropped.
Yes, and yes, it is, and then the fucking plot is that Hollywood, her goal is to escape, is to basically have sex with Gabriel Byrne. She seduces him because I guess that turns her into a human. At least it turns her into like live action. And then she escapes the cool world, goes into like real world Las Vegas, and is trying to like become a real person.
Honestly, a lot of parallels with Monkey Bone, which is another fascinating, weird movie that shouldn't exist.
Yeah, another one that I have not seen, but I'm aware of how crazy that movie is.
I don't know. That's an E for egregious for sure at some point, I think, in the future.
Yeah,
there's a lot to talk about with it, but. Yes, so Cool World is definitely one of these weird aberrations, but I think it's important also while we're talking about sort of these follow-ups to Roger Rabbit, a big thing with this movie is also there's no sequel to it, despite it making a shit ton of money. It cost like $50 million, made $351 million in fucking 88 money, so big hit, and they tried for several years to make a sequel. Are you aware of the various different failed sequels to Roger Rabbit?
Vaguely, but not much. What did they try to do? Because this movie does not seem like it would. I mean, you can make a sequel of it, but like, again, it's a just perfect little movie. Why would you make a sequel of it? But yes, it's what are some of the attempted sequels?
So the first one that was attempted was a prequel called Toon Platoon, which was supposed to be a prequel that's about Roger Rabbit apparently being born to human parents, or at least like living with human parents, and realizing he's a toon, and then he leaves with his human buddy to go to LA to find his mom. And along the way, they end up enlisting in the army, and they end up fighting against the Nazis who have captured Jessica and are forcing her to do like propaganda cartoons for them.
Okay.
Yes, so that was one that apparently was in production for a while in the early 90s, but then Steven Spielberg left because this is post-Schindler's List, and he's like, I don't want to do like a funny thing with Nazis. So he bails on that point. Then there was another one called Who Discovered Roger Rabbit, where he was going to become a Broadway star, and Alan Menken had written songs for the movie. They were doing animation tests for like a blend of CG and 2D. You can see that test out there. It's very odd.
Interesting.
It's a very curious attempt. But then Zemeckis kept saying he was going to do a sequel that the two main writers had written, and was going to have traditional animation for those characters, but attempt to do the motion capture stuff for everybody, including Eddie, because it was going to be Bob Hoskins returning, but sadly he obviously got Parkinson's and then died. Very sad. One of the greats. Then this is a weird one where the original writer Gary K. Wolfe was apparently co-writing a script where it was going to be like a version of this like old kind of like buddy comedy from the 50s called The Stooge, but it was going to be Roger Rabbit and Mickey Mouse in like a 50s buddy comedy movie, like Hope and Crosby.
Right.
Which this was in 2013 he pitched this, so that's like, oh, okay, that's gonna...
Oh, that's a really bad time.
Right, yeah. And then the most recent news was Zemeckis was still trying to do it, where he was gonna like put it in the 50s and have like Roger and Jessica like kind of move out of like Hollywood, because that's kind of a parallel to where the shorts were declining at that time, theatrical shorts, and it was gonna have like a digital Bob Hoskins.
That feels especially egregious.
Yeah,
given
100%.
recent like events.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, I think it's just, you can't recreate the synthesis of this movie, not just because of like what we're all talking about, where like the timing of it, but even like, what do you get out of a sequel to Roger Rabbit? Like, what do we need out of that? Like, the only stuff that actually got produced where they did some theatrical shorts. There were 3 theatrical shorts that are just like an average like Roger Rabbit and Baby Herman short. They're all like solid, like Tummy Trouble, Roller Coaster Rabbit, and Trail Mix-Up. They're on Disney Plus and elsewhere. They're fun like shorts, but at the same time, like, I don't know how invested I am in seeing Roger Rabbit like perform, because the genius of his character is like, he's the annoying presence that we're still endeared to next to Eddie Valiant, instead of just like, I don't really want to watch like a bunch of Roger Rabbit cartoons.
No, I mean, I would watch them if they were like, you know, in that sort of older animation style. But yeah, it's one of those things of like, you don't need a sequel. This movie ends so perfectly where like, we didn't mention the sort of the secret will of Acme, and you know, it's discovered, and he left Toontown to the Toons, and it's theirs, and they can live there, and it ends on such a perfect little note that you don't need a sequel. And as Space Jam proved, like, these sort of like, especially doing something like a legacy sequel is just a terrible idea for, you know, any of these.
Contrast that to a script leaked for the Toon Platoon movie, and this is like literally the ending of it is they just got out of the war, and Roger makes like a big speech in LA, and then the crowd parts and he sees his mom in the middle, and it's like this sweet moment. They like hug each other, and then he's like, but wait, what about my dad? And they pan over, and it's Bugs Bunny eating a carrot and saying "Ain't I a stinker" in the movie, like Iris is out.
Okay, that might be great, actually. That might be
I take
great.
it all back.
Yeah, I take it all back. Let's actually do that, because that's a really funny bit. Like you mentioned, like, Roger Rabbit is not like, I wouldn't want to see like just shorts of him like forever or nothing else, but like, I feel like his character in this movie is so, you get everything that you need in this movie. Like you said, like that annoying presence, and like, yeah, it is. You can't recreate that. It's, I don't think they should ever try to make a sequel to this.
The way I can firmly tell you that is, when I was younger, to go back to tie into theme parks. I keep bringing up theme parks on this show. I'm such
Let's go.
a Disney vlog boy or whatever. But when I was younger, there were 2 different Roger Rabbit attractions that existed at some point in either Disney park. There was the ride, I believe it's Cartoon Spin, which is only at Disneyland in California. So I've never been on that ride, never been over to Disneyland. But I've seen it's like a solid dark ride where like you are in Benny the Cab and you like see the weasels have like kidnapped Jessica. And recently they weirdly gave her like a trench coat, just as an example of like them. Like she literally is wearing like a Dick Tracy cosplay in the middle of this ride. The animatronic now wears a Dick Tracy coat. But contrasted to like I don't like I've wanted to go to Disneyland forever, but that's not my main sort of interest because when I was a kid, I got the perfect Roger Rabbit attraction at Disney MGM Studios back when Hollywood Studios was called that.
Okay.
And they just had an attraction that wasn't a ride, that wasn't anything except you went into the Acme warehouse. And, like, they had, like, some cutouts of, like, Jessica and Roger, but also they had, like, things hanging everywhere that were, like, very similar to the props. And, like, you would open up boxes and you would have, like, cartoon sounds come out. You could take a picture where, like, they set up a fake steamroller. And you could, like, put yourself in a little hole underneath and take a picture like you're being crushed. Like Judge Doom.
So cool. Yeah.
This is like the most simple attraction possible.
Yeah.
Have. And like I fucking ate it up every time I went to MGM, where it's just like, oh my god, I'm in the warehouse. Because that's the beauty of this movie. And like the sets and the props even already feel like, oh, they're so like fit perfectly. Like, I want to be in that world where I could hold like a cartoon object.
Gosh. Yeah, that would be great to do. I would love if they had that because like I'm imagining if you could like buy like, you know, go to the gift shop afterwards and buy one of those hammers that like the, you know, opens up to the I wonder like you could buy one of those maybe, like yeah, that'd be really cool. But
now it's gone. That's all we're like Galaxy's Edge is now, basically.
Yeah. Oh man. I've never been to Galaxy's Edge, have you?
I was literally planning to go with a buddy of mine in like March of 2020.
Oh, what happened? What happened? Did something happen in March of 2020? I can't
see
recall.
our Tenet episode for more details on that. But yeah, that's the thing is where like where my favorite kind of attraction is just being inside of like the fucking thing. Like that shows how great a movie is. Where it's like I don't need any animatronics. I don't need a show. Like they did Roger Rabbit shows and stuff. I think. That's another thing, too, where the weird licensing thing with Roger Rabbit, I think that's another big reason why this never happened, is that technically Disney and Spielberg own Roger Rabbit 50-50. Like, that's the deal. Like, you can't do another movie without both of them saying yes. And apparently Spielberg had, like, a lot of problems with, like, them particular. Like, he wanted one of the Roger Rabbit shorts to air in front of Arachnophobia when that was in theaters, but Disney strong-armed, like, no, we're putting it in front of Dick Tracy. Which, to be fair, fits a bit more thematically, I would say, with Dick Tracy. But yeah, and he just like was pissed off about that, and so he's in a weird place where like Roger was in the Disney parks for a while and was like all over the place, and then he's just really like disappeared as a character entirely, pretty much, except when he pops up in like the Chippendale movie, which we haven't mentioned that as one movie, right? Which is a fun movie that like
a very good movie,
arguably the most successable attempt at doing a similar thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a really fun movie, and I mean, like, I don't even. I guess one of my problems with that movie is that like, I don't love the way that they handle the references to other characters because it can feel like that sort of modern day thing of like, hey, you know these characters, so you like this thing. It's, you know, we're referencing this thing you like.
Well, yeah, the biggest problem with that movie is that they explain the joke more as opposed to like I got my interest in any kind of like old cartoons like that I watch in this movie, like the old Fleischer things. I'm just like, who's that guy? They don't explain it, but he looks cool. That's great. As opposed to like a great joke in that movie is the whole Polar Express like mocap world with like Seth Rogen and stuff like that. That's a fun bit, but they have to like explain the joke to everybody. Where it's like, remember that time in the 2000s where animation was like this? And it's a shame because like that's I think the bigger problem is like Disney attempting to do this, even getting great like, you know, talent with Lonely Island people and great voiceover people and making like a really fun movie. So at the same time, it has that element, but also even just that stink of like, but this is like a big Disney commercial, even though like we're making fun of ourselves, but we're also cool because of that. We're with
buy some Disney merch and let's go to Disney World and spend all your money
and watch all these old cartoons and things on Disney Plus.
Yes.
it's like a less overtly cynical version of like Space Jam: A New Legacy. I would say that's the biggest thing. It's like it's at least like disguising it a bit better.
Yeah, and that movie also is like genuinely funny, and like it's Sandberg and John Mulaney as like as Chippendale. Yes, they're really great. It has some really funny jokes. Yeah, that's probably the best kind of version of this.
But there still is a big gulf. That's how like it took us like almost 35 years to get to that point, and still it's just like this is good, but
it's not Roger Rabbit.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that's the magic and the beauty of this movie, and why it like still watching it just is so great. But yeah, is there anything else that we haven't?
Well, I mean, look, this is definitely one of those movies where it's like we could talk for hours about every single minute detail that's going on.
Look, it was really hard not to start recording and then this just be a 3-hour episode on just the weasels.
Right. Right. We haven't talked about the weasels that much.
The weasels are so hilarious. I mentioned earlier that I love that they look like 30s gangsters and with like their little revolvers and Thompsons. One of my favorite bits also in the movie is when they die, they all like become angels and float up to heaven.
And the psycho one like actually keeps the dip thing going and as he's like going up to heaven and shit. Yeah, they're so great. David Lander, who's an underrated comedian, as like the main weasel. Stop that laughing.
Yeah.
Or I don't rhyme with walls.
Yeah. No, but this does. Yeah, it's so great. And even that, like that little joke, I'm really glad you mentioned that because that feels like the type of joke that is handled so bad in so many other movies where like they're trying to make like, oh yeah, they're saying balls. It's, haha. Like if you're a kid, that's the funniest thing in the world to you.
Space Jam has that joke where it's like Sylvester opens the locker, like we've got balls, and just basketballs and shit come out. Like okay.
Yeah, but there it is. It's great because it's that Zemeckis thing you're talking about of like that sort of setup and then the sort of follow up of it of this is a great movie.
A big example of this, we didn't even talk about that much, but the actual backstory of Eddie Valiant's brother and how he like got the piano dropped in his head, which is a great example of like that's such a funny bit, but also Joanna Cassidy and Bob Hoskins take it so seriously. Like that scene where they're at the movie theater and he just does the whole thing, just like, yeah, we loved working Toontown with all a lot of laughs. It's like it's kind of funny, but also it's so sincere and heartfelt. And you're fully invested in him doing this. And then that makes even, like, the bit where he does, like, all the gymnastics and whatnot with, like, his, like, routine. I had, like, I hadn't felt this before, honestly, with this movie. I got kind of choked up because I just fully realized, like, oh, he's going back to his circus days from the pictures, back to, like, what him and his brother, who were, like, cut-ups, like, in the photo where they're at the academy, and they're being the silly ones with clown noses and shit like that. It's so... like sweet at the same time. It's like so funny seeing like Bob Hoskins get electrocuted with the pogo stick.
Yeah,
it's so dumb, but I'm like crying about it.
Yeah, and he's genuinely like pretty good at like the whole song and dance routine that he does there. It's so great, and we've been praising Bob Hoskins, but we can't praise him enough. Like he is really incredible in this movie.
He was definitely like one of those, like when he passed away back in 2014, I had a weird thing where I felt like somebody huge from almost my family was gone at that point. Because Roger Rabbit was so, like, I haven't talked about it that much, like my history with this movie, but this was a prime VHS movie for me as a kid. A go-to.
Of course.
I watched it so many times. I was so, like, I think it's a main reason why I have sort of this weird love of, like, the history of animation and also film noir and just, like, it's a movie coded so much in my DNA. Like, it's sometimes gonna be really rough going back to him, because sometimes you go back and, like, something's gone, something's a bit lost. I've watched this movie too many times and I know it by heart, but knowing it by heart doesn't make, like, it still feel like new every time I watch it. It just feels like this new experience every time with just new details I discover or just new ways I look at it. Like I was talking about with like the Eddie Valiant backstory. It's a fucking perfect movie.
It really is. Yeah. Cause it is funny cause I am not someone who grew up watching this movie. The first time I watched it, I was probably in my early teens maybe. Mm-hmm. And yeah, like putting it on, I put it on like earlier this afternoon, and I was like, okay, let's watch Roger Rabbit. I've seen this a few, I've seen it a few times since then, since I first saw it, and yeah, it just is it's perfect, and also it's one of those things where you blink and an hour's already passed, and it's already like, oh, there's 30 minutes left. Like there's it flies by, and yeah, I will say, like, I do the more that I watch this movie and I become kind of engrossed by it, I do, like, you become more like invested emotionally in like the Bob Hoskins in Eddie Valiant, and like the sort of amazing moment at the end where like Roger's like, you haven't lost your sense of humor, have you? And then he just gives him like a big old kiss. It's such a beautiful movie. It is. It's perfect, and it's literally perfect in every way.
Yeah, and especially also it being like so cynical about the industry of like just the film industry in general, but also being kind of like embracing just that love of performing and entertaining. Like it manages to like have that weird balance where like it's pure, but also it acknowledges like this business is terrible and chews people up, but goddamn, we love putting on a show.
Yes, it is it's such an entertaining movie, and yet, yeah, it has moments that are like kind of dark. It has moments that are kind of like a bit upsetting if especially if you see them too young, and like, and yet no element kind of, it is all about sort of the fun and the laughter of this movie. It's such a hilarious movie.
Sometimes it's the only weapon we have.
That's true. That is true. But yeah, it's a great movie. Is it? I'm very curious. Where would you put this in your Zemeckis ranking? Is it at the top?
That's. I mean, we'll talk about Back to the Future at some point in some form, but it's
sure.
It is also like a perfect. That's the thing with fucking Zemeckis, man. Is like he has a couple of like near perfect movies,
yes.
Which is like such a bummer when you consider that's like his Monkey's Paw. Like you got some of the greatest masterpieces of like the 80s and 90s, and now you're doomed to do Pinocchio and shit like that. Weirdly, like honestly, I had that weird flash where I realized Pinocchio's in the crowd shot at the end. You're just like, oh, I'm a wooden boy.
Yes, yeah.
And it's like, oh fuck, wow.
That's an omen for like 50 years later or whatever. Like, and like, yeah. I mean, I kind of like the last good movie, like Allied, is fine.
It's a good movie.
Yeah,
I would say of late period Zemeckis. It's, to be fair, like when I was going through Zemeckis like pretty much in order, and it was getting rough around that point. So I'm like, well, anything mildly good is like a top tier masterpiece. Allied, I love it. Honestly, okay, here's my top 5 for Zemeckis.
Sure.
So you got Back to the Future number 1, Roger Rabbit's number 2,
of course,
Death Becomes Her number 3.
Okay.
Castaway number 4.
Right.
And then this is the one that might be controversial to some people out there. Back to the Future Part 3.
Part 3. That is the one when I watched the Back to the Future movies back like in high school, when I was like, first watching them and discovering them and whatever. That was the one that I didn't love. I'll be honest.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of like what I hear is a lot of people are more aimed at like 2, because like 2015 and like going back to the 50s and whatnot. I think it's a really solid movie, but at the same time, it feels kind of like the early rumblings of like that Zemeckis that we get later.
Sure.
I would argue, where like it still is like very fun, and Bob Gale is still coming through as co-writer and having like fun stuff with that movie the whole time, but it feels a bit more focused on just the different technologies that he has at that time, like the Vista cameras and shit like that, which are also used in this movie, which is also another big thing where like they had cameras that would go on a specific like timed rotation and whatever, like it was computer timed kind of thing, so that they could, it's the only way they could have like these characters like really pop together, live action animated. But yeah, then he just, he looked into Tom Hanks's cold, computerized dead eyes and said, that's my future. That's what I want to do.
Yeah. I mean, does he have anything coming up? I'm kind of curious to see. He's got something called Here. Like HERE with, I guess, Tom Hanks, isn't it? Oh, it's apparently set in a single room. follows the many people who inhabit it over years and years, from past to the future. I mean,
That kind of sounds interesting, actually.
it sounds kind of interesting, but he also has another movie in production, which sounds awful. It's called The King, and
Oh, was that the Dwayne Johnson Hawaii
this is
movie?
the Dwayne Johnson movie.
That's been in production for
Yes.
forever. They announced that like 7 years ago. I don't know if that's still happening or not.
Yeah, I mean, it says in development, but yeah, it doesn't. I don't know.
Plus, that sounds too interesting for even The Rock to attempt. It's like, no, but I can't, like, do the one eyebrow and then sell you my tequila? No, thank you. That takes effort? No.
Yeah.
Call Dave Bautista to do that if you want a wrestler making effort.
Or even John Cena. Like,
I mean, to be fair, both Bautista and Cena, I think, would not be appropriate casting for a lot of reasons for that movie.
yeah, that's true.
But anyway, yeah. So you know what? We've been talking for a while. This is definitely gonna be our longest episode.
yeah.
So far, at least. I don't know. Next week, tune in. Yeah. Do you have any like final things? Because I think we summed it up pretty well. Any final tidbits about Roger Rabbit before we kind of move to Between the Lines?
Nothing else from what I've just mentioned. Love, just like it's perfect. It's such a it is a masterpiece, like a genuine, just one of the greatest, like, just, I mean, animated films, kind of, in a weird way. It has this, it's so perfect in what it is doing, and like you mentioned, it was made at just the perfect time, and no movie has done this as well as this movie, not even fucking close. Yeah, it's a movie I watch that makes me so interested in a director I kind of have no interest in. Like, I don't love Robert Zemeckis at all, and yet because he made Roger Rabbit, I'm kind of so fascinated by him and by his career.
And I mean, he has that where, like, but between that and Back to the Future, the whole trilogy, he kind of just has that, like, fuck you, I can kind of do what I want as long as you give me money. That's the thing at this point. It's like, I can do anything, but you still have to give me the money for it. I don't know how many more opportunities he has of that necessarily, but I don't know. I'm hoping for that Here movie. I had no idea about that before you said anything, but that sounds at least like the most interesting thing he could do at this point. And especially because it's like one room, and we're not, like, going everywhere.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll get him out of this fucking, like, just his uncanny CGI era that he's kind of been in, especially recently with, like, fucking Welcome to Morrowind and Pinocchio especially. Like, yeah,
I'll at least say this much. Honestly, like, before Pinocchio, I'll at least say even Robert Zemeckis at his worst is so fascinating. Like, Polar Express and even A Christmas Carol are fascinating just in terms of, like, why are you doing this? This is, like, such a bad idea. And Morrowind especially. Morrowind is definitely an E for egregious bookmark. We have to talk extensively about that movie. Like, that's the thing, is he has, even at his usual worst, that's interesting, but then Pinocchio is like, I just felt sad. Like, you felt angry. I felt, like, so sad watching that whole thing.
It is a very sad movie to watch, and yeah, and also felt so, like, just how bad that movie is, hit so much harder after, like, the Guillermo del Toro Pinocchio, like, came out, like, a few months after, and that movie is fucking incredible and is so creative, is packed with so much creativity and, like, a vision for what del Toro wanted to do. And yeah,
there's an essay to be written about the weird trilogy of 2022 Pinocchios, because there's those two, and then that weird Pauly Shore one that was, like, animated in Russia or something,
right.
that also came out, like, in January of that year.
Yeah. But what about you? What had any closing thoughts on Who Framed Roger Rabbit?
I said it earlier. I agree with you. It's just it's a perfect movie. And when I say perfect, it's definitely, like, there are some things that maybe don't hold about this movie, like, say, the Native American bullet, which, to be fair, they're referencing old cartoons, but there's certain, like, bits and pieces, even, like, the weird stuff they changed. Like, you're aware of the weird censorship stuff, right, with this movie? Where, like, in the original, like, theatrical version, it was all the way until, like, its Laserdisc release. There was a point when, like, Benny the cat's wheels get dipped, and just Rabbit, like, flies out of the car. You see a brief shot of, like, underneath her skirt. That was, like, yeah. It was very different from, like, the version you see now, where it's like, oh, clearly, like, red cloth's covering it. Nope. that wasn't the case apparently.
Yeah. Huh. Very interesting.
But yeah, so like stuff like that feels a bit like weird and lascivious in a way that doesn't hold up necessarily. But the core of the movie and the core of like everybody involved is just, it's so phenomenal. It's like I said this earlier, and Zemeckis has been quoted as it's like it's 3 different movies in one. It's a noir live action movie. It's half of like an animated movie, and it's a special effects extravaganza. And it plays all of it so casually. Like I said, that casual flex element of it, it just makes it all the more appealing that it's like this confident at doing something no one had really attempted this perfectly before, and few have tried and succeeded since.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a good way to cap things off.
Right, and let's go into our weekly segment now, Between the Lines. So, Between the Lines is a segment that we do every week in which, in relation to a, whatever movie we're talking about, at the end we recommend a movie that either, like, could be a potential other modern masterpiece kind of thing that fits the letter for the episode, or just something, kind of related to some degree. And I'm going first here, and my pick is another film from the animation director Richard Williams, who we didn't go into much of his like career, but that's also fascinating with like The Thief and the Cobbler, which I told you about, which is like that's a whole other episode. But he also did a couple other projects before Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and one of them is my recommendation. It is his 1977 film Raggedy Ann and Andy: A Musical Adventure, which is a movie that came out, like I said, in 77, interestingly, right around the same time as Star Wars, so that's probably why you haven't heard of it, why you probably didn't go see it. It just got delayed to, like, 77 in May, and it's like, oh, you're not making any money, Richard, I'm sorry. But basically, this follows sort of the Raggedy Ann and Andy characters, so you've seen, like, the dolls, the kind of floppy toys that you would see, say, in the Warrens' actual version of Annabelle, for example. But this movie, it starts off with live action with this little girl who's played by Richard Williams' daughter, Claire, who has got, Raggedy Ann in her arms and, like, brings her over to her room and then drops off this toy, and then all of a sudden, her room turns into an animated landscape, and all of the toys come to life. And they're all abuzz about the fact that it's her birthday, and she just got a new toy, who is this French doll that everyone kind of like tries to embrace, but she thinks she's like, oh, I want to go back to my original home world of Paris. That strange far off land. But point is, very similar to Toy Story, I noticed. Very fascinating.
Yes.
Came, once again, 77 to 95 for Toy Story. But basically this French doll is saying like, oh, I want to go back to France or whatever, and there's a snow globe that contains a little pirate guy inside, who is like, oh, she looks so beautiful. She's the love of my life. I want to get down. And then Raggedy Ann and all the other toys were like, hey, let's get him out of the snow globe. And so they cut a whole Mission Impossible style, and all the water comes out, and the ship goes over, and he's like, oh, great. I'm going to kidnap you and leave the room. And literally, I love the animation where it's like the ship has like little oars that come out of the bottom, and they like manage to make it go up to like up down the floor, up the wall, and through the window.
That's so cool.
Then Raggedy Ann and Andy are like, oh, we have to save her. So they go on a big odyssey outside, where they run into other toys and just other, like, the thing about this movie is, I watched it, I'd heard some people say who had, like, seen it when they were, like, kids in the 70s, who had said, like, oh, I watched it, it was really fucked up, it was weird. And I'm like, okay, I'm curious to watch it. No exaggeration, like, even before they leave the toy room, but especially afterward, this becomes a surreal, near nightmare at times, but also a weird dream. Like, that's the thing, it feels so bizarre where, like, Richard Williams, as I said, like, would, really believed in, like, we have to do full animation, we can't second guess anything. There's very, like, one animator per character, and each character has such a distinct style, and they're so weird where it's like, there's a point where they go to Looney Land, and it's just this random part of the woods where everyone acts like weird cartoon characters, and one of the guys he runs into, this guy they ran into is like a guy dressed up as a knight, but he has like a weird like purple hue and a giant nose, and he's like, oh, I love you, I can't believe you're in Looney Land. So he's deeply upsetting, but it's and all of the characters, like especially the Raggedy Ann and Andy, also have like they have the proportions and movements of like a doll. If it came to life, it doesn't have any like bones in it, so they're like kind of flopping around. But they're all performing these songs that are written by Joe Raposo, who is most famous for like he wrote all the early songs of Sesame Street, like Sunny Day, or even also he did the music for The Great Muppet Caper, the second Muppet movie.
Hell yeah.
Rules. Great songs. Stepping Out Like a Star. But anyway, this movie it's kind of like, it's not available to rent or stream anywhere. I watched it because there was a few different versions that are uploaded on YouTube. Particularly, I want to shout out the guy Garrett Gilchrist, who is the guy who's been leading like the charge to restore The Thief and the Cobbler. Great, something he's been working on for 20 years. But he also uploaded like a scan of a 35mm print that's in kind of rough shape. But it's like 4K. It looks beautiful. But also even like the weird edges kind of add to the unsettling nature of the movie at the same time.
Right.
So I'd recommend if anyone wants to see this. There's other stuff. Like there's a point where they go into like one part of the forest and they find like this location where like the ground starts to move like water and then it becomes sentient, and it's this character who like is the water ground, who's like, oh, I just keep eating all the time, and he like eats himself and goes in, and like the main characters nearly get eaten multiple times. There's him, or like the sad camel toy that they meet, who's like, oh, I had sticks for my arms and they're broken, so I can't get up very well, and sings a song about how sad he is, and it's kind of just like a bummer, but it's beautifully animated. That's the thing. This movie is a lost relic. I would love to see, like, Criterion doesn't do a lot of animated movies, but this feels like a very interesting one. I would legitimately love to see them like restore and have like some special features about it and shit. I think it's an underrated, almost masterwork that especially just is so odd and like would never. It's another movie that I don't think could ever happen now because of how just like upsetting and weird it is. Like down to they have these weird like dolls that do Greek chorus stuff. These just two weird dolls that sing for 15 seconds about like, where'd you go? Where'd you go, Raggedy? Oh yeah, and that happens multiple times, and there's no explanation for it. It's a very weird movie. I'd recommend it to anybody if you were interested in weird animation, lost gems. This is a great one.
Yeah. Yes, for mine, I'm not going with a very obscure movie. In fact, it is a movie directed by one of the most famous filmmakers in the world. It is a film from 2011. Steven Spielberg's The Adventures of Tintin. Genuinely a masterpiece, for one. A really incredible movie that also continues to age in a fascinating way because it is a movie that, again, uses a sort of live-action elements but animates them.
I mean, it's a mocap thing very similar to what Zemeckis was doing.
Right, and yet it looks miles better than any of the stuff Zemeckis was doing. And it is some of the most creative, like, action set pieces that I think Spielberg has done in like the later part of his career, and has that swashbuckling adventure, that tone that is so incredible. And I believe you mentioned that you said it was like this is probably the last sort of Indiana Jones type of movie that is like really great and really like it is so much fun. And I don't have any attachment to like Tintin as a character.
No, yeah.
I've never like read any of those, but the movie is so energetic and so incredible and just looks unbelievable. Like it is one of the incredible cases I think for like why animation is so important, because like it's you would never be able to do this in live action unless you were like it was like a $300 million movie or something like that. Like the set pieces are just so insane. It is. I also think it's the best Uncharted movie that we've ever gotten because it had very similar tone to the Uncharted games. Man, it came out in 2011 and we haven't gotten a sequel. I remember the plan, if I remember correctly, was that like Spielberg was going to do the first one and then Peter Jackson would do the second one. And then I guess Peter Jackson discovered that he could restore old footage and has been doing that for...
Well, I mean, that was right before The Hobbits as well came out. Like, that was the year before.
Oh,
so
well,
that was,
yes.
like, more what he was dealing with at that time. I think, honestly, like, there's such a fascinating case for like how those movies derailed that man as like a person. It derailed everyone.
Yeah.
Like those movies where it's just like, oh, I have to pick up production and no one's gonna direct this, but I have to because I don't want everyone to lose their job, so I'll do it. But
yeah, and those movies are a disaster.
Yeah, they're pretty much
very fascinating. But yeah, The Adventures of Tintin. It's great. It's got a great cast. I mean, it's great. Like Andy Serkis is a voice in it as like the captain. It's great to see him like. Of course, he does like a lot of mocap stuff, but it's great to see him in something like this where he is like, you know, he's not like he's not Gollum or he's not King Kong or he's not like an ape, right? He's just a guy. And like Daniel Craig as the villain is incredible. Yeah, it's just a really creative and inventive blockbuster. Also, like it's just such a big movie. Yeah, it's a great late era Spielberg, as many movies are. If anyone for some reason hasn't seen this movie, just please go seek out The Adventures of Tintin. It's an absolutely incredible movie.
Well, to be fair, sadly, I think that is kind of the case with Tintin, at least in the States. Like, I remember it made nothing in the United States. Like, it was definitely, like, I remember I went and saw it theatrically, and, like, no one was there, basically, during that, like, holiday weekend where it came out, like, right before Christmas. It's such a bummer, because, like, I also see a lot of, like, shit-talking of Tintin. They kind of, like, a lot of people lump it in with those Robert Zemeckis mocap movies, and it's not that. And it's such a bummer that, like, the mocap thing basically died with Tintin. Because that was right after, like, ImageWorks fell apart because Mars Needs Moms was, like, in February of that year. And that whole production company shut down, so we never got the Zemeckis mocap remake of Yellow Submarine. Which is a weird thing that almost happened.
Sounds awful. Sounds so bad.
Sounds so bad, yet fascinated, once again, to, like, see that train wreck. But it's a bummer that Spielberg just, like, he came in with one movie and just, like, oh, I perfected this. And
he did.
I would love to have seen, like, other people take that route that he was doing with Tintin. Because I agree with you, like, the action sequences are so great. That whole finale, where it's just, like, classic Spielberg shots, but without the restraints of gravity and human foibles.
Yeah, and a camera, you know, having to put a camera somewhere, you know, up high or whatever, yeah. I mean, Spielberg is so great at sort of moving the camera and, you know, motion and the way he blocks, you know, the way he does blocking is so incredible. And, like, that movie, yeah, it is him, like, sort of just free to do crazy shit for that entire movie.
It's another example of, like, not having any of the limitations for animation, kind of like a Roger Rabbit. That's the thing, like, Spielberg, even, like, in relation to this movie, but also even Animaniacs, which he produced and was, like, very creatively involved in, and shit like that. Right. The dude loves classic animation. Like, he has a deep respect for it, and, you know, without him, we also wouldn't have gotten, like, the American Tail movies, a lot, like, the two Don Bluth movies like that, and Land Before Time were ones that he produced, and shit like that. A lot of, like, the great underrated animated movies, particularly of, like, the 80s and 90s, he had a hand in. Also, this one from the 2010s, that I agree with you, deserves so much more. It is, I think in my Spielberg, like, top 10, it's, like, number, like, 8 or 9, which is pretty big for, like, Spielberg.
Yeah. I mean, let me see where it lands on mine. I think it is pretty high. I have it at number 9 in my Spielberg ranking.
Yeah. That's a lot of competition to get in the top. It's hard to get in that top 10.
It is. It really is. It is so much fun. It like also just that thing of Spielberg being like a great entertainer. Like he wants to entertain people and tell a great story, and he knows how to tell that story through, you know, action. And it's really incredible movie. That's my recommendation for this episode.
Yes. So once again, our recommendations, in case you missed them, I had the 1977 Richard Williams directed fucked up masterpiece of Raggedy Ann and Andy: A Musical Adventure.
Yes, and I had Steven Spielberg's 2011 film, The Adventures of Tintin.
One of two 2011 Spielberg films that came out within less than a week of each other.
That is true, and you know, the other one, it's an interesting Spielberg movie. I've wanted to revisit it for a while. War Horse, of course, is the movie we're referencing.
War Horse is what we're referencing. Yeah, my least favorite Spielberg movie, and I'll hold myself to that for now. I haven't rewatched it.
Well, because 1941 though.
I mean, bad. That's down there. That's amongst like the bottom of the Spielbergs,
Isn't Zemeckis tied to that movie? Didn't he write it or something?
1941, yes. That was
yes, yeah.
the 3 movies that he and Bob Gale wrote but didn't direct or fascinating, because it's that one, it's Trespass, the Walter Hill movie, very underrated, really great with like Ice-T,
And Ice Cube.
and Ice Cube, yes, the two of them, the Ices, are finally reunite together. It's a very cool burr. And then the weird other Tales from the Crypt movie that no one talks about, Bordello of Blood, which apparently is based on a script they wrote in like college together, and is very bad in contrast to Demon Knight. Bordello of Blood sucks so much.
This has one of the ugliest posters I've ever seen, with like the woman's legs and like this skeleton looking through it. It looks kind of ugly. I hate it.
Oh god. Just that age gap thing comes up even more. I'm so old because you don't know who the Crypt Keeper is.
This is the thing where I've learned who the Crypt Keeper is over the years, just through like, being on Twitter, on like film Twitter or whatever. But yeah, no, not really. I don't really know.
Oh god, Tales from the Crypt's great. I need to have we need to somehow watch Demon Knight and Tales from the Crypt on this podcast.
I'm down. Hell yeah, let's go.
But anyway, we've been going long. We gotta wrap up.
Yeah,
we're going long. So we want to, do our close here, including, you know what? I want to read some feedback real quick from somebody. We're recording this right after the release of the Blair Witch episode. Agent Black Acid, or Nick G, as he's called, on Twitter, says, "Wonderful episode, gents. Have either of you seen the Good Bad Flicks video essay on what Book of Shadows would have been without the studio interference? I've watched this a few times. Could have been a very interesting sequel. Well, thank you for the compliment, Nick."
Yes, thank you.
I have seen that. That was part of actually my research for that particular episode. If you want more detail on like the version I talked about of Book of Shadows, I would recommend that particular video. It goes into a lot more detail about what could have been, basically, with that movie.
Interesting. Huh. I have not seen that, but I will be seeking that out. So thank you.
Yes, thank you, Nick. Now, we need to thank some other people, like Burial Grid for our intro and outro music. Purchase his music at burialgrid.com. Thanks to Michelle Kyle for our artwork. Find her at MichKyle96. That's M-I-C-H Kyle96. And commission some artwork from her. We love the artwork, Michelle. And thanks, of course, to our patrons over at patreon.com/cinema2letter, where for $1 every month, you get access to bonus podcasts we cover, where we're especially covering a lot of recent releases. Like we would have already put out, as of now, our Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, and our double-header Barbenheimer discussion of both Barbie and Oppenheimer, which we're about to do as of this recording. That's almost...
In a few days.
In a few days. We're going to be
here.
Yes. But you get access to that. And also, by the end of the month, I'll have up our bonus podcast. We do one big one every month, and it'll be, this month, our top 10 directorial debuts, which we have recorded. Was a lot of fun, a lot of interesting choices neither of us expected on there. Yes,
that's a great episode.
Yep, almost 2 hours long. Kind of, a bit shorter than this one. But we also, if you want to see more of us, please find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at cinema2letter, or any other social media platforms we might be moving to in the near future. And also, you can find me specifically on Twitter and Letterboxd at @NotTheWho'sTommy, and also do some writing at marianithomas.wordpress.com and at film-cred.com. And once again, it's August. If you're in the Atlanta area on the Labor Day weekend, you can see me at DragonCon. If you have the DragonCon app, you can look up my schedule for all the different panels I'll be doing. And yeah, come say hi.
Yes, and you can follow me on Letterboxd at my name, Bryan Andrade, BryanAndrade, and then on Twitter, I am at Bryan Drade. It's a nice little portmanteau of my name, followed by the number 3. Follow me on there to see what movies I'm watching.
And to hear more about movies we've been watching, you can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other podcasting platforms. If you're listening on Talk Film Society, why not listen to all the other great shows on the network? And you can also dig into our archives and our Podbean feed for all the episodes in this particular miniseries, or the old Double-Edged Double Bill stuff you can find on the feed. And if you can't support us for the Patreon, that's cool. Money can be tight. The totally free way to help us out is to rate, review, or simply share the show around to give us more visibility. Please do so.
Yes.
My
Sorry,
favorite,
I've-
my favorite animated character, Bryan, just so lively and wild. But now, you know what? Before we go, we have to tease our next episode, our finale
Yes.
for the Blockbuster season.
Yeah.
It'll be our A for Atypical, which in this case is going to be Last Action Hero.
Yes. Hell yeah. Talking Arnie. Talking McTiernan. Talking, Charles Dance.
That's true. Talking Shane Black as well.
Absolutely. Hell
in that
yes.
movie. And interestingly, I think is very thematically tied to this one in terms of it kind of feels like the end of when you could do a movie kind of like Roger Rabbit. And that that movie feels like kind of like the last attempts that really just failed miserably.
Yes, but I mean, I think that movie is phenomenal, and I believe you also like it, so it'll be.
Yeah, I think our opinions differ from the audiences of 1993, 30 years later, shockingly. Who would have
Sure.
guessed?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes,
but that'll be next week. And until that time, you know what? I mean, I think, to quote a great master, that's all, folks.
Hey, that's a good line. I should use that.
And then Tinkerbell comes in to appease Michael Eisner, and we're done.
Yep.